Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story. I used to think the best part of working late nights was the silence. When I pulled into my driveway after a shift, usually somewhere between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, the whole neighborhood felt abandoned. No porch lights, no cars passing, just the faint orange glow of a street lamp at the entrance of the cul-de-sac and the crunch of gravel under my tires. It was peaceful in a way only empty places can be. That night felt no different. I remember sitting in my car for a moment longer than usual, finishing the last sip of lukewarm coffee from my thermos. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoed once, then faded. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and walked up to my front door. The house was dark, just like I left it. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the temperature. It felt colder than it should have, like the heat hadn't kicked on yet. I shrugged it off. Old house, old system. I locked the door behind me, dropped my keys into the bowl on the counter, and stood there for a second, listening. That's when I heard it. A low, steady sound coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was the refrigerator. It made noise all the time. A dull hum, sometimes a click. But this was different. This sound had texture. A faint hiss layered with a soft crackling, like paper being slowly crumpled. Static. I walked closer, my shoes barely making a sound on the tile floor. The glow from the kitchen caught my eye before the source did. A dim, bluish light reflected off the cabinets. The radio was on, not playing music, not even a voice, just static. The kind you hear when you turn the dial just slightly past the station you want. I stood there staring at it, my hand hovering in the air, trying to remember if I'd turned it on before leaving for work. I hadn't. I never listened to the radio at night. I reached out and turned the knob. The static cut off instantly, and the kitchen fell silent. Too silent. I became aware of my own breathing, slow and controlled, and the faint ringing in my ears that follows sudden quiet. I laughed under my breath, the sound thin and forced, and told myself I was tired. People forget things when they're tired. As I turned away, heading toward the hallway, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The volume knob wasn't all the way down. It was set to exactly the level I liked, low enough to barely hear from the living room, but loud enough to know it was on. And that's when a thought crept in, cold and unwelcome. Someone hadn't just turned the radio on. They'd stayed long enough to listen. I was 32 when this happened, old enough to have routines I didn't question, and young enough to still believe a quiet life meant a safe one. Back then, my world was simple. Clock in, clock out, don't make waves. I worked evenings at a distribution warehouse just off Route 9. The kind of place that looks like a gray shoebox from the highway. No windows, just loading bays and floodlights, and those long lines of trailers with their red reflectors blinking like sleepy eyes. My shift started at 6, but I always got there early because I hated walking into the break room with everyone already gathered around the vending machines, half awake, half annoyed. The drive to work was the same every night. Route 9 was busy earlier in the evening, But by the time I made the turn toward the industrial park, the traffic thinned out. The road signs flashed by. Gas stations, chain restaurants, a storage facility, a liquor store that kept its neon open sign on, like it was afraid of the dark. In winter, the sky got that hard black look before it was even late, and the headlights on the highway made everything feel underwater, like I was moving through a tunnel of white beams and wet pavement. I had a stainless steel coffee thermos I carried like it was part of my uniform. It wasn't fancy. It had a dent on the side from when I dropped it on the concrete outside the loading dock. I filled it with cheap coffee from the kitchen at home. Too much creamer, not enough sugar, and it stayed lukewarm by midnight. But I drank it anyway. It was something warm to hold, something to do. Inside the warehouse, the air always smelled like cardboard and diesel, and whatever someone heated up in the microwave. That microwave smell, stale popcorn, burned burritos, leftover spaghetti, clung to the break room like a ghost. You'd step in, and it hit you right away. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that faint electrical buzz you only noticed when the room went quiet. The vending machine rattled when it dropped a soda. The ice maker clicked. The intercom would crackle now and then, spilling out a supervisor's voice that sounded too loud and too flat, like it wasn't coming from a real person. Most nights, I kept my head down. I did my job. I didn't socialize much beyond the usual, "How's it going?" and "See you tomorrow." I liked it that way. The warehouse had its own rhythm. Pallet jacks squealing, tape guns snapping, scanners beeping like impatient little alarms. It was noisy, predictable, and in a strange way, comforting. When you're surrounded by constant sound, you don't have to listen to your own thoughts. By the time my shift ended, it was usually between 1:30 and 2. Sometimes later, if a truck came in behind schedule and everyone got stuck unloading. When we were done, we'd walk out into the cold parking lot, the wind hitting our faces like a slap, and the floodlights would make the snow sparkle harshly on the asphalt. The kind of light that didn't feel warm, no matter how bright it was. I'd get in my car, turn the heater on full blast, and just sit there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, letting my body come down from the noise. Then I'd drive home. My neighborhood was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in the country. This wasn't farmland or open fields, but the suburban kind. The kind built for people who wanted space without being isolated. Houses spaced out just enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors unless they were mowing their lawns. Driveways wide enough for 2 cars. Sidewalks that got salted when it snowed and cracked in the summer heat. I lived at the end of a cul-de-sac, tucked away like the last house on a list. At night, the street looked different. The same houses that felt normal during the day turned into dark shapes, their windows reflecting the streetlights instead of showing anything inside. Most of my neighbors were the type who went to bed early. The whole block would go black, one porch light at a time, until the only glow came from the street lamp near the entrance, and a few motion lights that blinked on when a raccoon or a stray cat wandered too close. My own motion light was mounted above the garage. It wasn't the best one money could buy, but it did its job. When I pulled into my driveway, it would click on with that quick, sharp sound, like a switch being slapped, and wash the front of my house in pale yellow light. I liked that moment. It made me feel like I was arriving somewhere that belonged to me, somewhere awake enough to notice me. Inside, the house was ordinary. Beige walls, beige carpet, the kind of interior you forget the second you leave it. I kept things neat, not because I enjoyed cleaning, but because clutter made my mind feel crowded. Keys went in the same bowl by the kitchen counter every time. Shoes stayed by the door. Mail stacked in a tidy pile I kept meaning to go through. The only unusual thing about the place was the old intercom system. It was built into the wall in the hallway, a little plastic panel with a speaker grill and a row of yellowed buttons labeled for rooms that didn't even make sense anymore. Kitchen, master, patio. The previous owner had been elderly, and I guess at one point the intercom had been their way of shouting across the house without moving. When I bought the place, the realtor called it a charming vintage feature. I called it useless. I never used it. I barely remembered it existed most days. My nights at home were quiet in the best way. I'd kick my shoes off, reheat something simple, maybe stand in the kitchen eating straight out of a bowl. The refrigerator would hum. The heater would kick on and off. Sometimes I'd leave the TV on low in the living room, not because I was watching, but because I liked the sound of voices filling the rooms. Then I'd go to bed. And for a long time, that routine worked. It made my life feel safe, like nothing unexpected could reach me through all that repetition. The same commute, the same thermos, the same buzzing lights and beeping scanners, the same motion light flicking on over my garage. That's what I believed anyway. Because when you live like that, quiet, predictable, and alone, you start thinking normal is the same thing as protected. And you don't realize how wrong you are until something small changes. Not a break-in, not a smashed window, nothing dramatic. Just a sound you know you didn't leave behind. I didn't realize how cold the kitchen floor was until my bare foot touched it. The carpet in the hallway was warm from the heat vent, but the tile beyond it felt like ice, sharp and immediate. I stopped mid-step without thinking, my weight awkwardly balanced, and waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. Another sound, maybe. Proof that what I'd heard was still there. The radio sat on the counter by the window, exactly where I always kept it. It wasn't anything special. One of those small plastic AM/FM radios you pick up at a hardware store because it's cheap and reliable. I mostly used it in the mornings when I was getting ready for work. Low volume, local news, weather updates I never paid attention to. At night, I never touched it. The display glowed a dull green, numbers faint, but clear enough to read if you were standing close. 2:37 a.m. The static came out steady and controlled, not loud, not chaotic. It filled the kitchen just enough to be noticeable, like it wanted to be heard, but not announced. The sound wasn't harsh. It rose and fell in subtle waves, almost breathing. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have mistaken it for the refrigerator at first, but I was paying attention. I stood there, my foot still half on the tile, half on the carpet, and listened. The refrigerator hummed behind me, low and mechanical. Every so often, it clicked, a clean, familiar sound. The heater in the hallway vent whispered as warm air pushed through. The static threaded itself between those noises, weaving into the house's usual nighttime rhythm like it belonged there. That was the part that bothered me most. It didn't sound out of place. I took another step into the kitchen. The cold bit into my other foot now, anchoring me in my body, reminding me I was awake. I flexed my toes against the tile, grounding myself, and tried to remember turning the radio on before I left for work. I pictured the morning in my head, standing at the counter, coffee brewing, the radio murmuring quietly in the background, while I checked my phone. I always turned it off before I left. Always. I didn't like leaving electronics running when I wasn't home. It was one of those habits you pick up and never question. Still, habits aren't the same as certainty. I told myself I must have forgotten. That explanation slid easily into place, almost too easily. I'd worked a long shift. My head was full of numbers, pallet counts, and the echo of forklifts reversing. People forget things all the time. I was no exception. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the volume knob. It felt cool under my skin, smoother than I expected. I twisted it slowly, watching the numbers on the display blur as the sound faded. The static thinned, dropped away, and then it was gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. I didn't move right away. I kept my hand on the radio, waiting. Sometimes electronics made noises even after you turned them off, little pops or clicks as they settled. But the radio stayed dead quiet. The display dimmed. The kitchen returned to its baseline sounds. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. "See?" I muttered to myself, the words sounding strange in the empty room. Nothing. I laughed under my breath, a short, humorless sound, and shook my head. The laugh didn't make me feel better, but it made me feel less foolish for standing there frozen like that. As I turned away, something caught my eye. I glanced back at the radio. The volume knob hadn't been turned all the way down. It was set just a little above 0, exactly where I usually left it during the day. Low enough that you could barely hear it from the living room, but loud enough that the sound filled the kitchen if you were standing near the counter. That stopped me. I stared at the knob longer than I meant to, my brain working through the detail like it was a math problem I couldn't quite solve. If I'd turned the radio on accidentally before leaving for work, the volume wouldn't have been set like that. I would have twisted it without thinking, either too loud or completely off. This was precise. That thought made my stomach tighten, but I pushed it away before it could take shape into something worse. Precision didn't mean intent. It meant routine. Muscle memory. Something I'd done so many times I didn't remember doing it. I told myself that over and over as I finished getting ready for bed. I brushed my teeth. The mirror showed a familiar face. Tired eyes. Faint stubble. Nothing out of the ordinary. I changed clothes, tossed them into the hamper, and turned off the lights as I moved down the hallway. When I reached my bedroom, I hesitated before closing the door. I never slept with the door fully closed. I liked knowing I could hear the house, the heater, the refrigerator, the small, reassuring noises that meant everything was working the way it should. That night, I left the door open a little wider than usual. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house settled around me the way it always did. Wood contracting, air moving through vents. Somewhere outside, wind brushed against the siding. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Just as my eyes started to drift closed, the static replayed itself in my mind. Not the sound exactly, but the way it had shifted. How it had dipped lower for a moment, then risen again, as if someone had adjusted the dial by hand. I told myself I was overthinking it. That was when the heater clicked off. The sudden quiet made the room feel larger, emptier. I became aware of my own breathing again, of the way the silence pressed in once the familiar noises dropped away. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. 3 soft taps, not from the front of the house, not from outside, from somewhere close, somewhere inside the walls. I held perfectly still, every muscle tense, listening as hard as I could. The taps didn't come again, and eventually, because exhaustion always wins, I convinced myself they never really happened at all. The knocks didn't come back the next night. That alone should have made me forget about them. One strange sound, one restless night, and then nothing. Most people would have written it off as the house settling or a half-dream bleeding into wakefulness. I almost did. When I came home the following morning, the kitchen was quiet, the radio dark, the walls unremarkable. No taps, no static, nothing that couldn't be explained away. But then it happened again. 3 nights later, at 2:41 a.m., I was brushing my teeth when I heard them. 3 taps, spaced evenly apart, each one soft but deliberate. Not loud enough to echo, not hard enough to sound aggressive. They came from the same general area as before, somewhere inside the walls near the hallway, close enough that I felt them more than I heard them. I froze with the toothbrush still in my mouth, toothpaste burning slightly against my gums, and listened. The sound stopped as soon as it started. No follow-up, no scrape or shuffle afterward. Just silence sliding back into place like nothing had disturbed it. That was when I checked the time. I didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Something about the exactness of it made my chest tighten. I rinsed my mouth, wiped my face, and stood there staring at my reflection, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself the same thing I'd told myself before. Old house, pipes, temperature changes. The explanations came easily, lined up and waiting like excuses I'd rehearsed. The problem was, the knocks didn't stay random. They came again 2 nights later, then 4 nights after that. Always 3 taps, always the same spacing, always late, and always after I got home from work. That detail crept up on me slowly, the way uncomfortable realizations tend to. I didn't notice it right away. I was too focused on the sounds themselves, on whether they were louder or closer or different in any way. But after the 5th time, after the 6th, I started checking the clock automatically whenever they happened. The pattern was impossible to ignore once I saw it. If I got home at 2:30, the knocks came sometime after that. If my shift ran late and I didn't walk through the front door until nearly 3, the house stayed quiet until then. On the one night, I stopped at a gas station on the way home to grab a drink. The taps didn't come until almost 20 minutes later. Never before I arrived, never while I was gone. That realization changed the way the house felt. I became hyper-aware of my movements, my routines. I noticed how the floor creaked in the same spots every time I walked down the hallway, how the refrigerator's hum dipped slightly right before it clicked off, how the heater made a hollow knocking sound of its own when it cycled on. I listened harder than I ever had before, trying to separate the familiar noises from the ones that didn't belong. At work, I caught myself glancing at the time more often, watching the clock tick toward the end of my shift. There was a tension building under my skin, a sense of anticipation I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding ridiculous. I didn't tell my coworkers. I didn't tell anyone at all. Talking about it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I tested it. The idea came to me on a Wednesday night, the middle of the week, when the warehouse was slower and supervisors were more flexible. I volunteered to leave early, claiming I had a headache. No one questioned it. I clocked out just after midnight, a full 2 hours earlier than usual, and walked out into the cold parking lot with a strange, nervous energy buzzing through me. The drive home felt wrong. Route 9 was still busy at that hour, headlights streaking past in both directions. Restaurants were open, gas stations lit. The world wasn't asleep yet, and that alone made my skin prickle. I kept expecting to feel relieved, but instead, I felt exposed, like I was breaking a rule I didn't fully understand. When I pulled into my driveway, the motion light clicked on as always. The house looked the same, quiet, still. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, listening. Nothing. I went through my routine anyway. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, back door. Everything was normal. Too normal. I ate something small, turned on the TV for background noise, and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. The heater kicked on and off. A car drove past outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then went quiet. The house did what houses do at night, filling the space with small, meaningless sounds. But the taps never came. I stayed up longer than I needed to, longer than I wanted to. I didn't go to bed until nearly 3, long after the time the knocks usually happened. When I finally did lie down, my body felt heavy, my mind buzzing with the absence of something I hadn't wanted in the first place. That night, I slept straight through until morning. No taps, no static, no interruption. The next evening, I went back to my regular shift. I didn't change my routine. I didn't mention the early night to anyone. I worked until close to 2, drove home the same way I always did, and pulled into my driveway under the flickering streetlight. The motion light came on. The house waited. At 2:38 a.m., 3 taps echoed softly from inside the walls. I sat on the edge of my bed, fully dressed, heart hammering, staring at the open doorway. The sound was unmistakable now, familiar, expected. That was the moment denial stopped working. The knocks weren't random. They weren't mechanical. They weren't tied to temperature or time alone. They were tied to me, to my presence, to the simple fact that I was home. Someone or something was waiting. And whatever it was, it knew exactly when to start knocking. The knocks didn't come back the next night. That alone should have made me forget about them. One strange sound, one restless night, and then nothing. Most people would have written it off as the house settling or a half-dream bleeding into wakefulness. I almost did. When I came home the following morning, the kitchen was quiet, the radio dark, the walls unremarkable. No taps, no static, nothing that couldn't be explained away. But then it happened again. 3 nights later, at 2:41 a.m., I was brushing my teeth when I heard them. 3 taps, spaced evenly apart, each one soft but deliberate. Not loud enough to echo, not hard enough to sound aggressive. They came from the same general area as before, somewhere inside the walls near the hallway, close enough that I felt them more than I heard them. I froze with the toothbrush still in my mouth, toothpaste burning slightly against my gums, and listened. The sound stopped as soon as it started. No follow-up. No scrape or shuffle afterward, just silence sliding back into place like nothing had disturbed it. That was when I checked the time. I didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Something about the exactness of it made my chest tighten. I rinsed my mouth, wiped my face, and stood there staring at my reflection, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself the same thing I'd told myself before. Old house, pipes, temperature changes. The explanations came easily, lined up and waiting like excuses I'd rehearsed. The problem was, the knocks didn't stay random. They came again 2 nights later, then 4 nights after that. Always 3 taps, always the same spacing, always late, and always after I got home from work. That detail crept up on me slowly, the way uncomfortable realizations tend to. I didn't notice it right away. I was too focused on the sounds themselves, on whether they were louder or closer or different in any way. But after the 5th time, after the 6th, I started checking the clock automatically whenever they happened. The pattern was impossible to ignore once I saw it. If I got home at 2:30, the knocks came sometime after that. If my shift ran late and I didn't walk through the front door until nearly 3, the house stayed quiet until then. On the one night I stopped at a gas station on the way home to grab a drink, the taps didn't come until almost 20 minutes later. Never before I arrived, never while I was gone. That realization changed the way the house felt. I became hyper-aware of my movements, my routines. I noticed how the floor creaked in the same spots every time I walked down the hallway, how the refrigerator's hum dipped slightly right before it clicked off, how the heater made a hollow knocking sound of its own when it cycled on. I listened harder than I ever had before, trying to separate the familiar noises from the ones that didn't belong. At work, I caught myself glancing at the time more often, watching the clock tick toward the end of my shift. There was a tension building under my skin, a sense of anticipation I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding ridiculous. I didn't tell my coworkers. I didn't tell anyone at all. Talking about it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I tested it. The idea came to me on a Wednesday night, the middle of the week, when the warehouse was slower and supervisors were more flexible. I volunteered to leave early, claiming I had a headache. No one questioned it. I clocked out just after midnight, a full 2 hours earlier than usual, and walked out into the cold parking lot with a strange, nervous energy buzzing through me. The drive home felt wrong. Route 9 was still busy at that hour, headlights streaking past in both directions. Restaurants were open, gas stations lit. The world wasn't asleep yet, and that alone made my skin prickle. I kept expecting to feel relieved, but instead, I felt exposed, like I was breaking a rule I didn't fully understand. When I pulled into my driveway, the motion light clicked on as always. The house looked the same, quiet, still. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, listening. Nothing. I went through my routine anyway. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, back door. Everything was normal. Too normal. I ate something small, turned on the TV for background noise, and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The heater kicked on and off. A car drove past outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then went quiet. The house did what houses do at night, filling the space with small, meaningless sounds. But the taps never came. I stayed up longer than I needed to, longer than I wanted to. I didn't go to bed until nearly 3, long after the time the knocks usually happened. When I finally did lie down, my body felt heavy, my mind buzzing with the absence of something I hadn't wanted in the first place. That night, I slept straight through until morning. No taps, no static, no interruption. The next evening, I went back to my regular shift. I didn't change my routine. I didn't mention the early night to anyone. I worked until close to 2, drove home the same way I always did, and pulled into my driveway under the flickering streetlight. The motion light came on. The house waited. At 2:38 a.m., 3 taps echoed softly from inside the walls. I sat on the edge of my bed, fully dressed, heart hammering, staring at the open doorway. The sound was unmistakable now. Familiar. Expected. That was the moment denial stopped working. The knocks weren't random. They weren't mechanical. They weren't tied to temperature or time alone. They were tied to me, to my presence, to the simple fact that I was home. Someone, or something, was waiting. And whatever it was, it knew exactly when to start knocking. I didn't plan to speak to it. That detail matters, because later, when I replayed the moment over and over in my head, I tried to convince myself that curiosity had gotten the better of me, or that fear had pushed me into doing something reckless. The truth was simpler and worse than either of those explanations. I spoke because the silence felt heavier than the noise ever had. It was just after 2:30 when the knocks came that night. I knew the time without looking at the clock. My body had learned the rhythm by then. 3 taps, evenly spaced, close enough together to feel intentional, but far enough apart that they couldn't be mistaken for a random creak. I was standing in the hallway when I heard them, halfway between the bedroom and the bathroom, barefoot on the carpet. The sound traveled through the wall to my right, dull and muted, like knuckles wrapped in cloth. It didn't echo. It didn't vibrate the floor. It simply existed, then stopped. I stood there, staring at the blank stretch of wall, my pulse thudding in my ears. The house felt different when the knocks stopped, too still, as if everything else was waiting. The heater didn't cycle on. The refrigerator didn't hum. Even the faint buzz I usually heard from the intercom panel seemed to drop away. I took a slow step closer to the wall. Up close, there was nothing to see. No cracks, no marks, just beige paint and drywall, smooth and ordinary. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the cool surface under my skin. The wall didn't feel hollow or warm or alive. It felt like a wall. That should have been enough. I pulled my hand back and stood there listening. Seconds passed, then minutes. The longer the silence stretched on, the more aware I became of my own presence, my breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as I shifted my weight, the quiet creak of the floor beneath me. It felt wrong to be the only one making noise. Without really deciding to, I leaned closer and lowered my voice. Not because I was afraid of being heard, but because whispering felt instinctive, like something you do in places where you aren't supposed to speak at all. "Hello?" I said. The word barely left my mouth. The response came immediately. 3 taps, same rhythm, same spacing, same exact sound. They were closer this time, not louder, not harder, just more present, as if whatever was making them had moved right up to the other side of the wall. The air in the hallway felt like it shifted, a subtle pressure change that raised the hair on my arms. I staggered back a step, my heel catching on the carpet. My heart slammed so hard it made me dizzy. I hadn't expected an answer. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't that. The timing was too precise, too perfect to dismiss. There was no delay, no overlap, nothing that could be blamed on coincidence. I swallowed and forced myself to breathe. "This is stupid," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. My voice sounded thin in the narrow space. "You're imagining things." I waited. Nothing happened. That small gap of silence almost calmed me. It gave my brain room to scramble for explanations again. Maybe I'd spoken at the same time the house shifted. Maybe the sound had already been coming, and I'd only noticed it after I spoke. Maybe. I cleared my throat. "Hello?" I said again, quieter this time, my voice barely more than air. 3 taps answered me instantly. I felt something cold settle in my chest, heavy and undeniable. The pattern wasn't just repetition anymore. It was response. Call and answer. Action and reaction. Listening. I backed away from the wall until my shoulders hit the opposite side of the hallway. The intercom panel was inches from my head now, its plastic surface dull and scratched from years of neglect. I stared at it, an old memory surfacing unbidden. My realtor's voice, cheerful and dismissive, calling it a charming vintage feature. I had never used it. I didn't touch it now. The thought that crossed my mind then wasn't about how or why the sound was happening. It wasn't about pipes or animals or wiring. It was about awareness, about intention. Whatever was on the other side of that wall knew I was there. It knew when I came home. It knew when I spoke. And it was waiting. I didn't say anything else. I moved slowly, deliberately, back toward my bedroom, keeping my eyes on the hallway wall the entire time. I half expected the taps to follow me, to migrate through the house the way footsteps would. They didn't. They stayed where they were, silent again, as if satisfied. I closed my bedroom door that night. That was the first time I ever did that. I lay in bed with the light on, staring at the door, replaying the sound in my head until it lost all connection to anything familiar. Knocks weren't supposed to answer you. Walls weren't supposed to listen. Houses didn't react to voices. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to dismantle what had happened, one fact remained untouched by denial or logic. The sound had heard me, and it had answered, not randomly, not accidentally, but on purpose. The knocks didn't come back the next night. That alone should have made me forget about them. One strange sound, one restless night, and then nothing. Most people would have written it off as the house settling or a half-dream bleeding into wakefulness. I almost did. When I came home the following morning, the kitchen was quiet, the radio dark, the walls unremarkable. No taps, no static, nothing that couldn't be explained away. But then it happened again. 3 nights later, at 2:41 a.m., I was brushing my teeth when I heard them. 3 taps, spaced evenly apart, each one soft but deliberate. Not loud enough to echo, not hard enough to sound aggressive. They came from the same general area as before, somewhere inside the walls near the hallway, close enough that I felt them more than I heard them. I froze with the toothbrush still in my mouth, toothpaste burning slightly against my gums, and listened. The sound stopped as soon as it started. No follow-up, no scrape or shuffle afterward, just silence sliding back into place like nothing had disturbed it. That was when I checked the time. I didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Something about the exactness of it made my chest tighten. I rinsed my mouth, wiped my face, and stood there staring at my reflection, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself the same thing I told myself before. Old house, pipes, temperature changes. The explanations came easily, lined up and waiting like excuses I'd rehearsed. The problem was, the knocks didn't stay random. They came again 2 nights later, then 4 nights after that. Always 3 taps, always the same spacing, always late, and always after I got home from work. That detail crept up on me slowly, the way uncomfortable realizations tend to. I didn't notice it right away. I was too focused on the sounds themselves, on whether they were louder or closer or different in any way. But after the 5th time, after the 6th, I started checking the clock automatically whenever they happened. The pattern was impossible to ignore once I saw it. If I got home at 2:30, the knocks came sometime after that. If my shift ran late and I didn't walk through the front door until nearly 3, the house stayed quiet until then. On the one night, I stopped at a gas station on the way home to grab a drink. The taps didn't come until almost 20 minutes later. Never before I arrived. Never while I was gone. That realization changed the way the house felt. I became hyper-aware of my movements, my routines. I noticed how the floor creaked in the same spots every time I walked down the hallway. How the refrigerator's hum dipped slightly right before it clicked off. How the heater made a hollow knocking sound of its own when it cycled on. I listened harder than I ever had before, trying to separate the familiar noises from the ones that didn't belong. At work, I caught myself glancing at the time more often, watching the clock tick toward the end of my shift. There was a tension building under my skin, a sense of anticipation I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding ridiculous. I didn't tell my coworkers. I didn't tell anyone at all. Talking about it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I tested it. The idea came to me on a Wednesday night, the middle of the week when the warehouse was slower and supervisors were more flexible. I volunteered to leave early, claiming I had a headache. No one questioned it. I clocked out just after midnight, a full 2 hours earlier than usual, and walked out into the cold parking lot with a strange, nervous energy buzzing through me. The drive home felt wrong. Route 9 was still busy at that hour, headlights streaking past in both directions. Restaurants were open, gas stations lit. The world wasn't asleep yet, and that alone made my skin prickle. I kept expecting to feel relieved, but instead, I felt exposed, like I was breaking a rule I didn't fully understand. When I pulled into my driveway, the motion light clicked on as always. The house looked the same, quiet, still. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, listening. Nothing. I went through my routine anyway. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, back door. Everything was normal. Too normal. I ate something small, turned on the TV for background noise, and sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. The heater kicked on and off. A car drove past outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then went quiet. The house did what houses do at night, filling the space with small, meaningless sounds. But the taps never came. I stayed up longer than I needed to, longer than I wanted to. I didn't go to bed until nearly 3, long after the time the knocks usually happened. When I finally did lie down, my body felt heavy, my mind buzzing with the absence of something I hadn't wanted in the first place. That night, I slept straight through until morning. No taps, no static, no interruption. The next evening, I went back to my regular shift. I didn't change my routine. I didn't mention the early night to anyone. I worked until close to 2, drove home the same way I always did, and pulled into my driveway under the flickering streetlight. The motion light came on. The house waited. At 2:38 a.m., 3 taps echoed softly from inside the walls. I sat on the edge of my bed, fully dressed, heart hammering, staring at the open doorway. The sound was unmistakable now. Familiar. Expected. That was the moment denial stopped working. The knocks weren't random. They weren't mechanical. They weren't tied to temperature or time alone. They were tied to me, to my presence, to the simple fact that I was home. Someone, or something, was waiting. And whatever it was, it knew exactly when to start knocking. I didn't plan to speak to it. That detail matters, because later, when I replayed the moment over and over in my head, I tried to convince myself that curiosity had gotten the better of me, or that fear had pushed me into doing something reckless. The truth was simpler and worse than either of those explanations. I spoke because the silence felt heavier than the noise ever had. It was just after 2:30 when the knocks came that night. I knew the time without looking at the clock. My body had learned the rhythm by then. 3 taps, evenly spaced, close enough together to feel intentional, but far enough apart that they couldn't be mistaken for a random creak. I was standing in the hallway when I heard them, halfway between the bedroom and the bathroom, barefoot on the carpet. The sound traveled through the wall to my right, dull and muted, like knuckles wrapped in cloth. It didn't echo. It didn't vibrate the floor. It simply existed, then stopped. I stood there, staring at the blank stretch of wall, my pulse thudding in my ears. The house felt different when the knocks stopped. Too still, as if everything else was waiting. The heater didn't cycle on. The refrigerator didn't hum. Even the faint buzz I usually heard from the intercom panel seemed to drop away. I took a slow step closer to the wall. Up close, there was nothing to see. No cracks, no marks, just beige paint and drywall, smooth and ordinary. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the cool surface under my skin. The wall didn't feel hollow, or warm, or alive. It felt like a wall. That should have been enough. I pulled my hand back and stood there listening. Seconds passed, then minutes. The longer the silence stretched on, the more aware I became of my own presence, my breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as I shifted my weight, the quiet creak of the floor beneath me. It felt wrong to be the only one making noise. Without really deciding to, I leaned closer and lowered my voice. Not because I was afraid of being heard, but because whispering felt instinctive, like something you do in places where you aren't supposed to speak at all. "Hello?" I said. The word barely left my mouth. The response came immediately. 3 taps, same rhythm, same spacing, same exact sound. They were closer this time. Not louder, not harder, just more present, as if whatever was making them had moved right up to the other side of the wall. The air in the hallway felt like it shifted, a subtle pressure change that raised the hair on my arms. I staggered back a step, my heel catching on the carpet. My heart slammed so hard it made me dizzy. I hadn't expected an answer. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't that. The timing was too precise, too perfect to dismiss. There was no delay, no overlap, nothing that could be blamed on coincidence. I swallowed and forced myself to breathe. "This is stupid," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. My voice sounded thin in the narrow space. "You're imagining things." I waited. Nothing happened. That small gap of silence almost calmed me. It gave my brain room to scramble for explanations again. Maybe I'd spoken at the same time the house shifted. Maybe the sound had already been coming, and I'd only noticed it after I spoke. Maybe. I cleared my throat. "Hello?" I said again, Quieter this time, my voice barely more than air. 3 taps answered me instantly. I felt something cold settle in my chest, heavy and undeniable. The pattern wasn't just repetition anymore. It was response. Call and answer. Action and reaction. Listening. I backed away from the wall until my shoulders hit the opposite side of the hallway. The intercom panel was inches from my head now, its plastic surface dull and scratched from years of neglect. I stared at it, an old memory surfacing unbidden. My realtor's voice, cheerful and dismissive, calling it a charming vintage feature. I had never used it. I didn't touch it now. The thought that crossed my mind then wasn't about how or why the sound was happening. It wasn't about pipes or animals or wiring. It was about awareness, about intention. Whatever was on the other side of that wall knew I was there. It knew when I came home. It knew when I spoke. And it was waiting. I didn't say anything else. I moved slowly, deliberately, back toward my bedroom, keeping my eyes on the hallway wall the entire time. I half expected the taps to follow me, to migrate through the house the way footsteps would. They didn't. They stayed where they were, silent again, as if satisfied. I closed my bedroom door that night. That was the first time I ever did that. I lay in bed with the light on, staring at the door, replaying the sound in my head until it lost all connection to anything familiar. Knocks weren't supposed to answer you. Walls weren't supposed to listen. Houses didn't react to voices. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to dismantle what had happened, one fact remained untouched by denial or logic. The sound had heard me, and it had answered. Not randomly, not accidentally, but on purpose. The next thing I did, after I stopped talking to the walls, was install cameras. That decision didn't come from panic. It came from a need for structure. Proof. Something solid I could point to if the sounds came back again. I told myself it was practical, the same way people install cameras after a break-in or a package theft. A preventative measure, a way to regain control. I ordered a basic home security kit online. Nothing expensive. 2 indoor cameras and 1 for the back door, all tied into an app on my phone. The product description promised night vision, motion alerts, cloud storage. Words that sounded reassuring in a very modern way. I liked the idea of being able to check my house while I was gone, to see it empty and still while I was stuck under fluorescent lights at work. I mounted the first camera in the corner of the kitchen, angled toward the back door and the counter where the radio sat. The second went in the living room, facing the hallway. I hesitated over that one, adjusting it by fractions of an inch until it covered the doorway without showing too much of the bedroom beyond. I told myself I didn't need to watch myself sleep. When I finished, I stood in the middle of the house and looked around, imagining how it would appear on a screen. Everything felt slightly different once I knew it was being recorded. Less private, less forgiving, but also safer in a way that was hard to explain. That night at work, I checked the app more often than I meant to. Between tasks, I pulled my phone out and watched the live feeds load. The kitchen looked empty. The living room looked unchanged. The camera image had that faint fisheye distortion that made the corners of the room curve inward, like the house was folding in on itself. I told myself it was just the lens. By the end of my shift, I'd watched the footage so many times it all blurred together. Nothing moved. Nothing happened. The house stayed quiet and still, just like it always had. When I got home, there were no knocks. That should have made me feel better, Instead, it made me uneasy. Over the next few nights, checking the footage became part of my routine. I didn't just watch the live feed anymore. I reviewed the recordings. I scrubbed back and forth through the timelines, watching hours of nothing unfold and fast forward. The kitchen lights flicking on and off, the refrigerator door opening when I got home. Me moving through the frame, an anonymous figure I barely recognized. I started noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way the shadows shifted slightly when the heater kicked on. The momentary blur when headlights from a passing car flashed through the front windows. The tiny delay between motion and notification, just long enough to be unsettling if you thought about it too much. The footage became familiar, predictable. That was when I noticed the gap. It was subtle at first, just a small break in the timeline on a Tuesday night. I assumed it was a buffering issue or a glitch in the app. Cheap technology did that sometimes. I closed it and moved on. The next night, I saw it again. This time, I tapped into the settings and looked closer. The timeline jumped forward without explanation, skipping a chunk of time with no footage attached, no error message, no corrupted file icon, just nothing. I checked the timestamps. From 1:40 a.m. to 1:58 a.m., 18 minutes. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, my thumb hovering just above it. That time frame meant something to me immediately, even before I admitted it. It was the window between when I usually clocked out and when I pulled into my driveway. The drive home, the space where I was always gone. I felt a flicker of irritation before fear had time to settle in. Of course it would fail then, I thought. Of course the app would glitch during the one part of the night I wasn't there to see it. That was how technology worked. Inconvenient, imperfect, unreliable when you needed it most. I checked the other camera. Same thing. 18 minutes missing from both feeds, down to the second. I told myself it was a software update issue, cloud sync problems, Wi-Fi interference. The explanations stacked up quickly, each one dulling the edge of the discovery just enough to make it manageable. I even searched the product support page and found a forum thread where someone complained about missing footage during upload. That felt like a small victory. See, I told myself, it happens. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day at work, I found myself drifting, replaying the timeline in my head instead of focusing on the pallets in front of me. The warehouse felt louder than usual, the beeping scanners sharper, the intercom announcements jarring. I checked my phone during breaks, refreshing the app, half expecting to see another gap appear while I watched. It didn't. That night, when I got home, I checked the recordings again. No gap. The footage ran clean and uninterrupted from the moment I left to the moment I returned. I felt a strange wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by embarrassment. I shook my head and laughed quietly at myself. I was turning into someone I didn't recognize, someone who looked for problems because he'd already decided something was wrong. Over the next few days, the gaps appeared sporadically, not every night, not on a predictable schedule, always the same length, always during the same window, always when I was gone. I never saw motion alerts tied to those missing segments, no corrupted files, no system warnings, just empty time, neatly cut out and stitched back together like it had never existed. I told myself, again and again, that the system was cheap, that I'd gotten what I paid for. That software bugs didn't mean anything beyond inconvenience. I repeated those explanations until they felt smooth and worn, like stones I carried in my pocket to reassure myself they were real. What I didn't allow myself to consider, what I carefully stepped around every time the thought surfaced, was how clean the gaps were, how precise, how intentional they looked once you stared at them long enough. Technology failed all the time. That was true. But something about this failure felt personal. And even then, standing alone in my kitchen with my phone glowing in my hand, I chose the explanation that asked the least of me. I blamed the software, because blaming anything else meant admitting I wasn't just being watched. It meant admitting someone had access from the inside, and I wasn't ready for that yet. The first thing that changed was the way I locked my doors. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single night where I panicked and barricaded myself inside. It happened gradually, the way bad habits form. I'd lock the front door when I came home, walk into the kitchen, then pause. Something in my chest would tighten, just enough to pull me back. I'd walk to the door again, twist the knob, and listen for the deadbolt to catch. Once wasn't enough anymore. I needed to feel it, hear it, know it. Sometimes I did it 3 times before I could move on. I told myself it was temporary, a phase. People got cautious when they were stressed. That didn't mean anything was actually wrong. Still, the routine solidified quickly. Lock, check, walk away, come back, check again. If I tried to stop myself, my mind would fill in the space with images I didn't want to see. Doors opening silently, hinges moving without sound. Giving in felt easier than resisting. Sleeping changed next. I used to like the dark. I liked how the house disappeared when the lights were off, how it all blended into one quiet shape around me. That comfort evaporated without warning. One night, as I reached to turn off the lamp by my bed, my hand froze inches from the switch. The thought of the room going dark made my stomach drop, sharp and sudden. I slept with the light on after that. At first, it was just the hallway light, spilling a soft glow under the bedroom door. Then it was the bedside lamp, left on its lowest setting. The shadows bothered me more than the brightness ever did. They stretched and shifted in ways I didn't trust anymore. I'd lie awake staring at the door, my eyes tracing the thin line of light along the carpet, listening to every sound the house made as if it were speaking directly to me. Sleep came in fragments, shallow, restless stretches that left me more tired than before. Eating was the next thing to go. I didn't stop buying groceries. I didn't stop cooking entirely. I just stopped eating inside the house. One night after work, I pulled into my driveway, sat there with the engine running, and realized I didn't want to go in yet. The house was dark, still, waiting. The thought made my chest feel tight. So I stayed in the car. I ate a granola bar with the dome light on, crumbs falling onto my lap. Another night, it was a sandwich I'd picked up from a gas station on Route 9, eaten slowly while I stared through the windshield at my own front door. The motion light stayed off while I sat there, and something about that felt safer. As long as it didn't turn on, it meant nothing was moving near the house. I started doing it every night. The car became a buffer zone, a place where I could sit and breathe without feeling watched. I'd finish eating, wipe my hands on a napkin, and only then force myself to unlock the door and step inside. I told myself it was just convenient. Less mess, less cleanup. Another small lie that slid into place without resistance. At work, the changes were harder to hide. I missed details, double-checked counts I'd never had trouble with before. I caught myself staring at the same pallet for minutes at a time, my mind somewhere else entirely. The constant noise of the warehouse, forklifts beeping, scanners chirping, the intercom crackling overhead, started to wear on me in a way it never had before. It felt invasive, too loud, like it was pressing against my skull. I drank more coffee, chasing focus that never quite arrived. One night, a supervisor asked me if I was feeling okay. His tone was casual, but the question landed heavier than it should have. I told him I hadn't been sleeping well. That part was true. He nodded and told me to take it easy, then walked away, already forgetting the conversation. Others noticed too. A guy I'd worked alongside for years, someone who barely spoke beyond the basics, looked at me strangely one night while we waited for a truck to back into the dock. The warehouse lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression hard to read. "You all right, man?" he asked. "Yeah," I said automatically. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, longer than necessary. Then he shook his head slightly, like he'd come to a conclusion he didn't like. "You look like you haven't been home in a while," he said. The words hit me harder than I expected. I laughed it off, forcing a smile. "I'm home every night," I said, "same as always." He didn't smile back. He just shrugged and turned away, the conversation already over. But the comment stayed with me. It replayed in my head, on the drive home, echoing through the quiet streets, following me all the way into my driveway. I looked at my house differently after that. It didn't feel like a place I lived anymore. It felt like a place I passed through, a structure I entered and exited without ever settling into it. Even when I was inside, part of me stayed alert, listening, waiting. I moved more quietly. I avoided turning on unnecessary lights. I kept my phone on me at all times, the screen lighting up my face whenever I checked the camera feeds, searching for reassurance that never fully arrived. The footage stayed mostly normal, long stretches of nothing, me coming and going, shadows shifting with the heater. But the missing segments still appeared, scattered just enough to keep my nerves raw. Each time I saw one, my heart rate spiked, then slowly settled as I reached for the same explanations I'd been using all along. I was stressed. I was tired. Anyone would feel this way after weeks of poor sleep. That was what I told myself as I locked the door for the third time one night and stood there, hand still on the knob, listening to the house breathe around me. That was what I told myself as I lay in bed under the steady glow of the lamp, eyes burning, waiting for a sound that might or might not come. From the outside, nothing had changed. I still went to work. I still paid my bills. I still came home at the end of the night. But inside, the rhythm of my life had shifted in subtle, irreversible ways. I was no longer reacting to what was happening. I was adjusting to it, accommodating it, making room for something unnamed and unacknowledged. And the worst part was how quickly it started to feel normal. As if this, checking locks, sleeping in the light, eating alone in a parked car, was simply the shape my life was supposed to take now. As if I hadn't already lost control without realizing it, I didn't discover the deletion by accident. By then, checking the cameras had become a reflex, something I did without thinking, like touching my pocket to make sure my phone was still there. That night, I stood in the kitchen with the lights off, the glow from my phone, the only illumination in the room, watching the familiar fisheye view of my own living room load on the screen. Nothing moved. I switched from the live feed to the activity log, scrolling backward through the night. The timeline slid smoothly beneath my thumb, blocks of recorded footage stacked neatly together. I'd learned what a normal night looked like by then. Minor motion alerts when the heater kicked on. A brief spike when I walked through the frame, long stretches of nothing. Then the timeline jumped. Not glitched, not buffered. Jumped. I slowed down, zooming in on the break. The timestamps on either side of the gap sat there calmly, innocently, as if they didn't represent anything strange at all. 1:40 a.m. on one side, 1:58 a.m. on the other. 18 minutes, carved cleanly out of the night. I felt a familiar prickle of irritation, the old reflex rising up to shield me. Another upload error, I thought. Another cloud hiccup. I opened the settings menu, hunting for confirmation. Sync warnings, storage limits, anything that would let me write this off without effort. That was when I saw it. A line buried deep in the activity log. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Small gray text, almost apologetic in its plainness. Recording deleted manually. I stared at the words, my thumb frozen mid-scroll. For a moment, I assumed it meant me, that I'd somehow deleted the footage without realizing it, half asleep or distracted. I went back through the app's history, checking for any sign of access from my phone. There was none. No record of deletion from my device. No login from my account at that time. Just that single line, sitting there quietly between two perfectly intact recordings, manually deleted. I checked the other camera. Same gap, same timestamp, same note. The room felt colder all at once, like the heat had dropped without warning. I became acutely aware of the tile beneath my feet, the way the refrigerator's hum sounded louder in the silence. My breathing felt too fast, too shallow, and I forced myself to slow it down, counting each inhale like I'd seen people do in movies. This doesn't mean anything, I told myself. It just means someone accessed the system, a technician, a glitch mislabeling an automated process. Software doesn't always use language the way humans expect it to. I repeated that thought as I pulled up the detailed access logs. The list populated slowly, each entry marked with a time and an action. Live view accessed, motion alert generated, recording saved. I scrolled through them methodically, my mind already bracing itself for something I wasn't ready to see. There it was, an external access entry. The timestamp matched the deletion exactly. 1:49 a.m. I knew that time without having to think about it. I'd been driving then, somewhere between the warehouse and my house, usually passing the same dark stretch of road where the trees closed in and the streetlights disappeared. My phone would have been in the cup holder. The app closed. My hands on the steering wheel. I wasn't home. I wasn't even close. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and undeniable. Whoever accessed the cameras had done so during the precise window when the house was empty. Not before I left. Not after I returned. Not at random points during the night. They'd chosen the one span of time when no one was there to see them. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the legs scraping softly against the tile. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet house. I stared at the screen, reading the same line over and over, as if it might change if I looked at it long enough. Manually deleted. I thought about the placement of the cameras, the angles, what they could see and what they couldn't. I thought about the blind spot near the back door where the lens didn't quite reach. I thought about the nights I'd come home late and found nothing out of place, No sign that anyone had been there at all. Because why would there be? If someone knew exactly when to come and exactly how long they had. My chest tightened, a slow, creeping pressure that made it hard to sit still. I stood up and paced the length of the kitchen, then the living room, my eyes scanning every surface with new suspicion. The house looked the same. It always did. That was the problem. I checked the locks again, twisting each one until my knuckles ached. I checked the back door, the windows, the garage. Everything was secure. Everything always had been. I returned to the kitchen and looked at the phone one more time. The access log didn't show where the connection came from. No address, no name, just proof that someone had been there and cleaned up after themselves. Cleanly, quietly. This wasn't curiosity. It wasn't random interference. It wasn't a system error that happened to line up with my schedule by chance. This was timing, planning, knowledge. Whoever did this knew my routine. They knew when I left. They knew when I came back. They knew how long the drive took and how much time they had before I returned. And they knew how to make sure I never saw them on camera. I stood there in the dim kitchen, phone still glowing in my hand, and felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly. Fear had been there for a while already, but the collapse of the last explanation I'd been clinging to. Technology hadn't failed me. It had worked exactly the way it was supposed to, which meant the problem wasn't the system. It was the fact that someone else knew my schedule better than I wanted to admit. And for the first time, the thought surfaced fully formed and impossible to ignore. The house wasn't just being watched, it was being used. And whoever was doing it knew precisely when it was empty. I hadn't thought about the intercom in years. It was one of those things that blended into the background of the house so completely that my eyes skipped over it without my brain ever registering its presence. A square plastic panel set into the hallway wall, yellowed slightly with age, its surface scratched and dull. The small speaker grill was packed with dust. The buttons faded to the point where the labels were barely legible anymore. It had never made a sound since the day I moved in. As far as I was concerned, it was dead. That's why, when it crackled to life, I didn't recognize the sound at first. I was standing in the kitchen, staring down at my phone, scrolling through the camera logs again, even though I already knew what I'd find. My shoulders felt tight. My jaw clenched in a way that had started to feel permanent. The house was quiet around me, wrapped in that late-night stillness I'd grown to distrust. Then a noise cut through it, a sharp burst of static, sudden and loud enough to make me flinch. I looked up instinctively, my heart jumping into my throat. The sound didn't come from the kitchen. It came from the hallway, from the wall, the intercom. For a split second, I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, my brain lagging behind my senses. The static surged and dipped, filling the space with harsh white noise that bounced off the walls and made the house feel smaller, tighter. It wasn't the faint hiss I remembered from old movies. This was strong, clear, alive. My first thought was that something electrical had shorted out. Old wiring, a power surge, anything that didn't involve intention. I took a step toward the hallway, then stopped myself. The static continued, steady now, as if it had found a comfortable frequency and settled into it. I listened. Beneath the noise, something else began to emerge. At first, I thought it was interference, just another layer of static resolving itself. But then the sound deepened, slowed, took on a rhythm that didn't belong to machinery. Breathing. It was faint, almost lost in the hiss, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. Slow inhales, even exhales, close enough to sound intimate, like someone standing just on the other side of the wall, leaning toward the speaker. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move closer. I didn't move away. I stood there, locked in place, listening to a stranger breathe inside my house. The sound wasn't labored. It wasn't panicked. It was calm, casual, the kind of breathing you hear when someone is relaxed, when they have no reason to hurry. The static faded slightly, as if a hand had adjusted a dial. Then the breathing stopped. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. And then a voice came through. "Hey." Just that. One word. Soft. Clear. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't warped or metallic the way you'd expect a voice to sound through an old system like that. It came through naturally, almost warmly, like a friend calling out from another room. There was no accent I could place, no unusual cadence. If I'd heard it on the phone, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. That was the most terrifying part. My mouth went dry. I tried to speak and couldn't. The word echoed in my head, reverberating through me in a way the static never had. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement. I existed, and whoever was speaking knew it. "Sorry," the voice continued, after a brief pause. "Didn't mean to startle you." The tone was casual, almost apologetic, familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. It sounded like someone who belonged there, someone comfortable enough to worry about manners. I took a step back, my heel bumping into the kitchen counter with a soft thud. The sound seemed to carry too far, too loud in the quiet house. I waited for the voice to react. It didn't. "I wasn't sure if you were home yet," the voice said. "Your lights were off." My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might force its way out of my chest. I could hear my pulse in my ears, drowning out everything else. The words replayed themselves in my mind, slow and deliberate. "Not sure if you were home yet." That meant waiting. That meant watching. I swallowed, forcing air into my lungs. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar to my own ears. There was a brief pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Relax," the voice said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." The way it said hurt, casual, offhand, made my hands start to shake. There was no anger in the voice, no excitement, just reassurance, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be believed. I glanced down the hallway toward the intercom panel. It looked the same as it always had. Dead, harmless, completely ordinary. "This thing doesn't work," I said, more to myself than to the voice. "It hasn't worked in years." Another pause. A quiet exhale. "It does," the voice replied. "You just never used it." The statement hit me harder than anything else it had said so far. Not because it was threatening, but because it was observant, accurate. It implied familiarity with my habits, my routines, the way I moved through my own home without thinking. The voice wasn't guessing. It knew. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Someone outside with a radio transmitter. Someone inside the walls. Someone who had already been in the house and left something behind. None of them made sense. All of them felt possible. "You okay?" the voice asked after a moment. "You went quiet." The concern in its tone made my stomach churn. This wasn't a taunt. This wasn't someone enjoying my fear. This was someone checking in on a conversation they felt entitled to continue. The static crackled softly again, rising just enough to remind me of the medium carrying the sound. The breathing returned, faint and steady, filling the space between us. I stood there in the kitchen, my house around me suddenly unfamiliar, listening to a stranger speak from inside my walls, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. And in that moment, the last of my denial finally fell away. This wasn't a noise anymore. It wasn't a system glitch. It wasn't something I could ignore or rationalize into silence. There was someone else in my house, and they weren't hiding. I don't remember deciding to stop breathing, but at some point, I realized my chest hurt. It wasn't sharp pain. It was pressure, like my lungs had forgotten what they were supposed to do without being told. I stood there in the kitchen, staring toward the hallway where the intercom had gone quiet again, and waited for my body to catch up with reality. The silence felt wrong now, not empty, not peaceful. It felt alert, as if the house itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. I forced air into my lungs slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're trying not to panic. My hands were trembling, fingers buzzing with a strange numbness that made them feel both heavy and unreal. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a rational voice tried to surface, listing instructions like a checklist. Turn on the lights, call someone, get out of the house. I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I reached into the drawer by the counter and pulled out a flashlight. I don't know why I chose that over my phone. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because the flashlight felt solid in my hand. A simple tool that didn't rely on signals or screens or anything that could fail without warning. I clicked it on, and a narrow beam of white light cut through the dim kitchen, landing on the hallway wall. The intercom panel stared back at me, silent and unchanged. I waited for it to speak again. It didn't. That unsettled me more than if it had. I took a step forward, then another, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly as it moved with my hand. Each footstep sounded too loud against the floor, the soft thud of my weight echoing in my ears. I tried to move quietly, but my body refused to cooperate. I was hyper-aware of every shift, every breath, every scrape of fabric as my clothes brushed against themselves. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before. As I passed the intercom, I angled the light toward it, half expecting to see something different up close. A loose panel, wires sticking out, anything that would explain how it had come back to life. There was nothing. The plastic casing was intact. The buttons were untouched. Dust still clung to the edges like it always had. I moved on. The living room came next. The flashlight beam swept across the couch, the coffee table, the bookshelf against the far wall. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. No drawers pulled out, no cushions disturbed, no signs of movement or struggle or intrusion. The room looked staged, frozen in time, like a still image pulled from the camera feed. I told myself that was good. I didn't believe it. I checked the windows, running the light along the frames, the locks, the glass. Outside, the yard lay dark and empty, the trees at the edge of the property standing motionless against the night sky. No footprints, no shadows, nothing watching back. When I reached the back door, I paused. The air felt different there. It was subtle at first, just a faint chill against my skin. The heater should have been running. I'd turned it up earlier. I glanced down at the thermostat on the wall. The display glowed softly, reading a temperature that didn't match what my body was telling me. I held my hand out, palm open, feeling for warmth. There was none. The air near the door felt cold and heavy, like it had pooled there and refused to move. It crept up my arm, raising goosebumps, making my fingers stiff. I shined the flashlight along the edges of the door, checking for gaps, for signs that it hadn't sealed properly. Everything looked secure. Still, the cold persisted. I turned slowly, scanning the room again, my breath now visible in faint wisps I hadn't noticed before. The beam of the flashlight cut through it, making the air look thick and grainy, like fog caught indoors where it didn't belong. My heart started to race again. I backed away from the door, moving toward the center of the room, but the temperature didn't rise. If anything, it dropped further. The chill spread outward, seeping into the rest of the house, crawling along the floors and walls with a patience that felt deliberate. I checked the bedroom next. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, the sound making me flinch. The flashlight swept across the bed, the dresser, the open closet. Clothes hung undisturbed. The bedspread lay smooth, unwrinkled. Nothing had been touched. That was the problem. If someone had been there, really been there, I wanted signs of it. Disorder. Proof. Something concrete I could point to and say this happened. The absence of evidence made everything feel worse, like the house was actively denying what I'd experienced. The cold followed me into the bedroom. It settled around my legs, my waist, creeping higher with each passing second. My teeth started to chatter. Sharp clicks I couldn't control. I wrapped my free arm around myself, trying to hold on to warmth that wasn't there. I stood in the middle of the room, flashlight shaking in my grip, and realized something with a sudden clarity that made my stomach drop. The temperature wasn't dropping everywhere at once. It was changing where I was. When I moved, the cold seemed to adjust, as if it were tracking me, keeping pace just behind my skin. The thought sent a jolt of panic through me so intense I nearly dropped the flashlight. I turned in a slow circle, the beam spinning with me, illuminating the walls, the ceiling, the empty space around my body. Nothing. I backed toward the bed and sat down hard, the mattress dipping under my weight. The cold pooled around me instantly, seeping through the fabric, making my muscles ache. I felt small then, smaller than I had in years, hunched under the weight of a presence I couldn't see, or touch, or understand. My mind raced, grasping for explanations that no longer fit. HVAC malfunction, drafts, circulation issues, words without meaning. None of them accounted for the voice. None of them accounted for the timing. None of them accounted for the way the house seemed to respond to me now, reacting instead of simply existing. I clicked the flashlight off and on again, the brief darkness making my heart lurch. The light came back. The room stayed empty. I sat there in the cold, listening to the silence stretch and warp around me, until the realization finally settled in, heavy and undeniable. Whatever had spoken through the intercom wasn't gone. It hadn't fled. It had simply stopped talking. And somehow, that felt far worse than anything it could have said. I stayed where I was for a long time after the cold settled into the room. I don't know exactly how long. Minutes blurred together when there was nothing to mark their passing. The flashlight lay on the bed beside me, still warm from my grip, its beam cutting a pale stripe across the wall. The house remained silent, but it was no longer an empty silence. It felt occupied, considered. I was just starting to convince myself that whatever had happened through the intercom was over. Finished. Contained. Something that had burned itself out when the sound returned. Not static. Not breathing. The intercom chimed softly. The same dull electronic click it must have made decades ago when it was new. The noise traveled through the hallway and into the bedroom like a tap on the shoulder, gentle and impossibly deliberate. My body reacted before my mind did. Every muscle locked at once, a full-body freeze that pinned me to the mattress. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, loud enough that I almost missed the voice when it spoke. "You're later than yesterday." The words were calm, observational, spoken with the same even tone as before, as if the voice were commenting on the weather or the time of day. There was no accusation in it, no threat, just a statement of fact. I stared at the open bedroom door, my vision narrowing around the empty hallway beyond it. The light from the bedside lamp spilled out onto the carpet, revealing nothing but shadows and stillness. My throat felt tight, my mouth dry, like I'd swallowed sand. "I didn't mean that as a complaint," the voice added, after a brief pause. "Just noticed." That was when the meaning sank in. Not "you're home now," not "I hear you," later than yesterday. My mind scrambled, replaying the last few nights in quick, overlapping flashes. The night I'd stayed in the car longer than usual, eating a sandwich under the dome light. The night I'd stopped for gas. The night I'd left work early and come home to silence. The pattern I'd recognized, but refused to name. "You keep changing things," the voice said, almost thoughtfully. "Locks, lights, timing." I felt something inside me give way, a subtle but final collapse of whatever resistance I had left. This wasn't someone reacting to noise or movement. This wasn't a presence triggered by my arrival. This was someone paying attention, someone tracking deviations, someone measuring my behavior against itself. "You don't have to do that," the voice continued, gentle enough to sound reassuring. "I can still tell when it's you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. Instead, I sat there, frozen, my hands clenched into fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. The house felt closer now, the walls pressing in as if drawn toward the sound. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was a pause. "Long enough," the voice replied. "Long enough to know when something's off." The casual certainty in the answer made my stomach churn. It wasn't bragging. It wasn't intimidation. It was familiarity. The kind that comes from repetition, from observation over time. "You walk heavier when you're tired," the voice said. "You check the back door twice when you're nervous. You pause before the hallway now." Each detail landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. They weren't guesses. They were accurate in a way that felt invasive, intimate. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd been broadcasting until someone repeated it back to me. I shook my head, even though the voice couldn't see me. "You don't know anything about me," I said, forcing the words out. A soft sound came through the intercom then, not static, not laughter, something closer to a sigh. "I know your routine," the voice said. "That's enough." The distinction mattered. It reframed everything. This wasn't about who I was as a person. It was about predictability, about patterns, about the way a life leaves tracks if you follow it closely enough. The temperature in the room dipped again, just a degree or two, but enough to make me shiver. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to make myself smaller, less present, The instinct was useless, and I knew it even as I did it. "You don't need to be afraid," the voice said. "Nothing's changed." I almost laughed at that. The sound caught in my throat and died there, turning into something closer to a sob. Everything had changed. The house, the silence, my understanding of what privacy meant. "Please," I said, and hated how small the word sounded. "Just stop." There was another pause, longer this time. I could almost imagine the other end of it. The consideration, the weighing of options, the quiet decision-making process happening somewhere I couldn't see. "I will," the voice said finally, "for tonight." The intercom clicked softly, then went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there, listening to nothing for so long that my muscles began to ache, my joints stiffening from the strain. When the heater finally kicked on again, the sound made me flinch so hard my vision blurred. I stayed awake until morning. When the sun rose, casting weak gray light through the bedroom window, the house looked the same as it always had. Ordinary, empty, harmless. But the normalcy felt like a lie now. A thin layer stretched over something deeper and far more dangerous. Because presence was one thing, awareness was another. And whatever was sharing my house wasn't just reacting to me anymore. It was learning, tracking, adjusting. It knew when I arrived. It knew when I left. It knew when I changed my behavior and when I tried to hide it. And the worst part, the part that settled into my chest like a permanent weight, was the certainty that came with that realization. This wasn't about being seen. It was about being known. And once something knows your patterns, it doesn't need to watch you all the time anymore. It just needs to wait. I didn't pack a bag. That was the first sign this wasn't a plan, just a reaction. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my wallet. Things you take when you're stepping out for a few minutes, not when you're running from your own house in the middle of the night. I didn't even turn the lights off. I just walked out the front door, locked it out of habit, and kept going. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and grounding. The motion light above the garage snapped on, washing the driveway in yellow light, and for a split second, I hesitated, half expecting to hear the voice again, casually commenting on how quickly I decided to leave. Nothing happened. The house stayed dark and silent behind me. I got in the car and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just followed the road until the neighborhood thinned out and the houses gave way to empty storefronts and gas stations that never really closed. The clock on the dashboard glowed an indifferent blue as the minutes ticked by. My hands shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly draining out of me and leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. The Walmart parking lot was already half full when I pulled in. That should have made me feel safer. Cars scattered under harsh white lights. A few people sitting in idling vehicles, silhouettes hunched over glowing phones. A truck parked near the far edge, its engine rumbling steadily like a living thing. The store itself loomed at the edge of the lot, all glass and metal and fluorescent promise, open 24 hours a day, as if daring the night to do its worst. I parked under a light and turned the engine off. The silence inside the car felt different from the silence in my house. Contained, predictable. I reclined the seat slightly and stared up through the windshield at the light overhead, watching moths and insects flicker through its glow. My breath fogged faintly in front of me as the warmth from the heater faded. I didn't sleep right away. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the voice. Not what it said, but how it sounded. Steady, familiar, unhurried. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who wasn't afraid of being overheard. Someone who didn't need to raise their volume to be heard. At some point, exhaustion won. I slept in shallow fragments, waking every time a car door slammed or an engine revved too loudly nearby. Each time I surfaced, disoriented and stiff, I had to remind myself where I was. The parking lot, the light, the thin layer of metal between me and the rest of the world. Morning came slowly. The sky lightened from black to gray, the horizon softening as the night released its grip. People started moving with purpose now, shopping carts rattling, engines turning over, voices carrying faintly through the air. I checked the time. Just after 6. I sat there longer than I needed to, watching the store swallow people and spit them back out again, trying to convince myself that the night had been an anomaly. Stress, sleep deprivation, a breaking point that had finally snapped and sent my imagination spiraling. Eventually, I drove home. The streets looked different in daylight, less threatening, more exposed. The cul-de-sac appeared smaller than I remembered, the houses closer together, their identical facades suddenly obvious. My motion light didn't turn on this time. The sun had risen enough that it wasn't needed. I parked and sat in the car, staring at my front door. From the outside, the house looked normal, exactly as it always had. No broken windows, no forced entry, no signs of anything out of place. That normalcy pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. It made me feel foolish for leaving, for sleeping in my car like someone who didn't belong anywhere else. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed wasn't a sound or a sight. It was the smell. Not bad, not strong, just wrong. The air felt stale, like it had been disturbed and then left to settle again. There was a faint undercurrent beneath the usual scent of detergent and old wood, something I couldn't place, but immediately recognized as unfamiliar. The house felt colder than it should have been. I set my keys down in the bowl by the counter, then stopped. They weren't where I expected them to land. The bowl had been nudged slightly to the left, just enough that my keys clinked against the edge instead of dropping cleanly inside. It was a tiny detail, the kind of thing you'd never notice if you weren't already looking for reasons to feel unsettled. I stood there, unmoving, listening. The refrigerator hummed. The heater clicked on. The familiar sounds resumed their places, but they felt rehearsed now, like a performance put on for my benefit. I walked through the house slowly, the way you do when you're not sure what you're looking for, but know you'll recognize it when you see it. The living room was unchanged, couch cushions undisturbed, coffee table clear. The bedroom looked exactly as I'd left it, the bed unmade from the night before. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. That should have reassured me. Instead, I was overwhelmed by the sense that I was standing in a place that had been occupied in my absence, not invaded, used. The difference mattered. It suggested familiarity, comfort, someone moving through the space without urgency, without fear of being caught. I stopped in the hallway and looked at the intercom panel. It was silent, dead again, dust undisturbed. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. The voice, the timing, the way it had known me. The house seemed determined to offer me nothing solid to hold on to, nothing I could point to and say this proves it. And yet, the feeling lingered. The sense that I had interrupted something, that I'd come back too early, unannounced, to a place that had briefly belonged to someone else. I stood there in the growing daylight, my house around me looking ordinary and untouched, and felt a certainty settle in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. I hadn't left in time to catch them, but I'd left long enough for them to feel comfortable. And whatever had been done inside my house while I was gone had been done carefully, deliberately, and with the confidence of someone who knew exactly which parts of the space belonged to them and which ones didn't. The proof wasn't in what had changed. It was in how normal everything looked afterward. I didn't see the note right away. That's what bothers me most when I think back on it. Not that it was there, but that I walked past it without noticing. I crossed the kitchen twice before it registered, my mind still busy cataloging the house for changes that weren't obvious. It was only when I turned back toward the counter to grab a glass of water that something caught the corner of my eye. A square of white against beige. I stopped mid-step. The note sat on the kitchen counter, placed neatly beside the bowl where I always drop my keys. Not tucked under anything, not hidden, just resting there, flat and deliberate, as if it had been waiting to be seen. The paper wasn't printer paper. It was thicker, heavier, with a faint grain to it that caught the light differently than the smooth surface of the counter beneath. I stared at it for a long moment without moving. The kitchen felt smaller all of a sudden, the ceiling lower, the air heavier. The refrigerator hummed behind me, a steady mechanical sound that felt too loud in the quiet. Somewhere in the house, a pipe clicked softly, then went still. I approached the counter slowly, my steps measured, careful not to disturb anything else. Up close, the paper looked older than I'd expected. Not yellowed, but not bright white either. The edges were clean, sharp, like it had been torn carefully from a larger sheet rather than ripped in haste. I picked it up. The paper was warm, not hot, not fresh from a printer warm, just warm enough that I noticed it, my fingers lingering a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The texture was rougher than it looked, fibrous under my skin, the kind of paper you'd choose if you wanted writing to stand out clearly. The words were written in blue ink, not marker, not felt tip, a ballpoint pen, judging by the faint indentations pressed into the page. The letters were neat, controlled, each one formed with care. Whoever had written it hadn't been in a hurry. The pressure varied slightly from line to line, heavier on the downstrokes, lighter on the curves, leaving a subtle map of movement you could feel if you ran your thumb over it. I didn't have to touch it again to know that. I could see it. The message was short, just one sentence. The kitchen camera doesn't see the back door when the light is off. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower, forcing myself to take in every word as if doing so might change their meaning. My stomach dropped, the sensation sharp and immediate, like missing a step on a staircase. The room seemed to tilt around me, my balance shifting as I leaned against the counter for support. The paper trembled slightly in my hand, betraying me. The kitchen camera. I looked up instinctively, my eyes snapping to the small black lens mounted in the corner near the ceiling. It stared back at me, unblinking. Its tiny indicator light, dark in the daylight. I followed the imagined line of sight from the camera to the back door, my mind tracing the angle the way I had dozens of times while adjusting it. I knew exactly what the note meant. At night, when the kitchen lights were off, the camera's night vision kicked in, infrared, grainy, limited. The field of view narrowed just enough that the far edge of the back door fell into shadow. Not completely invisible, but indistinct. A blur of motion instead of a clear image. A blind spot. I had noticed it once while reviewing footage and dismissed it as inconsequential. A technical limitation. Something that didn't matter because nothing was supposed to be there in the first place. Someone else had noticed it too. The realization pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I imagined someone standing in that shadowed strip of space, just out of frame, watching the camera watch nothing, watching me through the lens when I checked the feed, safe in the belief that I was alone. My fingers tightened around the paper until it crinkled slightly. The sound was small, sharp, and it echoed too loudly in my head. I forced myself to relax my grip, smoothing the note back out as if preserving it mattered. It did. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was information. Offered casually, confidently. The kind of information you share when you know the other person can't do anything with it. I set the note down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter. The placement struck me then. The precision of it. It hadn't been tossed aside or dropped at random. It had been placed exactly where my eyes would land, next to the bowl I used every single day. Close enough to be unavoidable. Familiar enough to feel personal. I checked the rest of the counter. Nothing else was out of place. No extra papers. No signs of rummaging. The cabinets were closed. The drawers undisturbed. Whoever had left the note had done so without leaving any other trace. I moved through the house again, this time with purpose. I checked the back door first, standing in the exact spot the note referenced. I turned the kitchen lights off and watched the camera feed on my phone, confirming what I already knew. The edge of the door dissolved into shadow, the frame cutting it off just enough to obscure detail. Someone could stand there and move slowly and never trigger a clear alert. I felt sick. I turned the lights back on and leaned against the counter, my mind racing through possibilities that no longer mattered. How long had they known about that blind spot? Had they tested it? Had they stood there while I slept, just beyond the camera's reach, listening to the house breathe? I thought about the handwriting again. The steady pressure, the lack of hesitation, the absence of emotion. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. This was someone documenting an environment they understood intimately. Someone comfortable enough to leave a note behind. The implications stacked up quickly, each one worse than the last. They'd been inside the house while I was gone. They'd moved through the kitchen without triggering the cameras. They'd stood close enough to the counter to place the note exactly where they wanted it, and they'd left without taking anything. I picked the note up one last time and turned it over. Blank. No signature. No smudges. No indentations bleeding through from another page beneath it. Just the message, isolated and complete. My hands started to shake again, a delayed reaction finally breaking through the numbness. I set the note down and pressed my palms flat against the counter, grounding myself in the cool surface. The house remained quiet around me, offering no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had just been revealed. This was the proof I'd been looking for. Not a sound, not a feeling, not a glitch or a gap in footage. A choice. Someone had chosen to tell me they knew where my cameras couldn't see. They'd chosen to tell me without being seen themselves. And as I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, staring at a single sentence written in careful blue ink, I understood something with chilling clarity. The cameras weren't there to protect me. They were there to show me how exposed I really was. I stood there, staring at the note, long after the words themselves stopped registering. The sentence had already done its damage. I understood the blind spot. I understood the implication. What I hadn't understood yet, what took longer to sink in, was where the note had been placed. Not just that it was on the kitchen counter, but exactly where. The bowl sat there like it always did. A shallow ceramic dish, off-white with a thin crack along one side that I'd noticed years ago and never bothered to replace. I'd picked it up from a thrift store when I first moved in, back when I was still figuring out where things belonged. At some point, without ever deciding to, that bowl became the place my keys went. Every night, no exceptions. I didn't set reminders. I didn't think about it. My hand simply moved there when I walked in the door, muscle memory guiding it without conscious input. Keys in bowl, wallet on counter, shoes by the door. The note hadn't been placed near the bowl. It had been placed flush against it, aligned so that the bottom edge of the paper ran parallel to the curve of the ceramic, close enough that when I dropped my keys earlier that morning, they'd landed partly on the paper instead of cleanly inside. That small disruption, the sound of metal clinking against paper instead of porcelain, was what had caught my attention in the first place. I hadn't realized that until now. I picked the note up again and slid it aside, then picked up the bowl itself. There was a faint ring of dust beneath it, the outline of where it usually sat undisturbed. The note had been placed after the bowl was already there. Not guessed, not approximated, placed with knowledge. My throat tightened as I set the bowl back down. Anyone breaking into a house could leave a note on a counter. Anyone could choose a visible spot. But this wasn't just visible. It was specific, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with repetition. Whoever had been inside my house didn't just know where things were. They knew where I put them. The realization rippled outward, touching everything else I'd dismissed along the way. The locks I checked repeatedly, the lights I left on, the nights I ate in my car, the way the voice had commented on my timing, my pauses, my changes. You keep changing things. The words echoed back to me now with new weight. I thought about the nights I'd come home and felt like the house had been waiting. The way nothing was out of place, but nothing felt untouched either. The sense of familiarity that had clung to the air like a smell you couldn't identify, but knew didn't belong. This wasn't surveillance from a distance. This was observation from close enough to learn habits. I moved through the house again, slower this time, my eyes drawn to the small, mundane details I'd ignored before. The way the chair at the kitchen table sat a few inches farther out than usual. The way the bathroom light switch felt slightly warmer to the touch than it should have been in the morning. The faint scuff mark on the floor near the back door that didn't match the pattern of my own shoes. None of it was definitive on its own. Together, it painted a picture I didn't want to see. Someone had been here long enough to blend in. I stopped in the hallway and looked at the intercom panel again. It stared back at me, blank and inert. I tried to imagine someone standing there, pressing the button, listening through the speaker while the house slept. I tried to imagine them moving through the rooms, careful not to disturb anything, careful not to leave traces beyond the ones they wanted me to find. The note wasn't a warning. It was a demonstration. I returned to the kitchen and sat down heavily in one of the chairs. My gaze fixed on the bowl and the space beside it where the note had rested. The realization settled into me slowly, sinking past fear into something colder and more destabilizing. They weren't just watching my routine. They were practicing it, putting things back where I put them, moving through the house the way I moved through it, leaving the environment unchanged, not because they were careful, but because they were comfortable enough to know how it should look when I returned. I thought about the nights the cameras showed nothing but empty rooms, about the blind spots, about the missing footage, about the careful deletion of 18 minutes at exactly the right time. Someone wasn't just avoiding being seen. They were learning how to replace me, if only briefly. The idea made my skin crawl. I picked up my keys and turned them over in my hand, the familiar weight suddenly foreign. I imagined someone else holding them, feeling the same grooves, the same worn edges, learning how they sounded when dropped into the bowl. I imagined them standing in my kitchen, mimicking my movements, my pauses, my unconscious habits, not to steal, not to vandalize, but to belong. A sharp laugh escaped me before I could stop it, brittle and humorless. It echoed faintly off the walls, sounding wrong in the quiet house. I covered my mouth, suddenly afraid of being heard, of drawing attention to myself in a place that no longer felt private. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't a random intruder exploiting weaknesses. This was someone studying a life, my life, learning it well enough to step into it without leaving a trace, to move through my space and leave it ready for my return, to place a note exactly where my hand would find it without searching. The fear that rose in me then was deeper than anything I'd felt before. It wasn't the fear of being hurt or confronted. It was the fear of being understood by someone who had no right to that knowledge. I gathered the note, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my pocket without knowing why. Preserving it felt important. Proof mattered now. Evidence that I hadn't imagined any of this. As I stood there in the quiet kitchen, keys clenched tightly in my hand, one thought looped through my mind with sickening clarity. If someone could mimic my habits this precisely, if they could move through my home and leave it indistinguishable from how I left it myself, then the line between my presence and theirs had already blurred. And the most dangerous part wasn't that they knew how I lived. It was that they were starting to live that way too. I told myself moving would fix it. That was the story I repeated whenever the doubt crept in. Whenever I caught myself standing still in the middle of a room, listening for something I couldn't quite define. Houses held memories, patterns, sounds. If I removed myself from the environment, the problem would stay behind. That was logical, clean, simple. So I started looking for apartments. I did it quietly, methodically, late at night after work, when the world felt thin and unreal. I scrolled through listings on my phone while sitting in my car, the engine running for warmth, the house dark behind me, 1-bedroom units, secure buildings, controlled access. Words like gated key fob, 24-hour security jumped out at me, glowing with promise. I toured places during the day, taking time off work when I could. Everything looked different in daylight. Hallways were brighter, corners less threatening. Leasing agents smiled and handed me brochures, their voices upbeat, rehearsed. They talked about parking, and trash pickup, and quiet hours, about how safe the neighborhood was. I nodded and asked the right questions, pretending my interest was casual. Inside, I was already gone. I chose a place that felt anonymous, a mid-sized apartment complex off a busy road. close enough to traffic that there was always noise. No cul-de-sac, no silence settling in after midnight. The building used electronic locks and cameras in the common areas. The unit itself was on the second floor, far enough from ground-level windows that I could breathe a little easier. Signing the lease felt anticlimactic. No sense of relief. No moment where the weight lifted. Just a dull acceptance, like I'd checked off an item on a list without understanding why it mattered. Packing the house took longer than it should have. I didn't realize how much space I'd filled until I started emptying it. Drawers that held nothing important but still needed to be sorted. Closets full of clothes I wore out of habit rather than preference. Boxes stacked in corners, each one making the rooms feel smaller, tighter. I worked at night, after my shifts, moving through the house with a strange detachment. The sounds of packing echoed in ways I wasn't prepared for. Tape tearing from the roll, cardboard flaps snapping shut, objects placed gently into boxes, one by one. Every noise seemed amplified, bouncing off walls stripped of decoration. The house began to hollow out. Rooms that once absorbed sound now threw it back at me. My footsteps echoed. My breathing felt louder. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more insistently, like it was aware of the change and resented it. I found myself hesitating over small things. The bowl by the counter, the chair in the living room, the intercom panel in the hallway. I left the intercom for last. It felt wrong to pack it, even though it wasn't coming with me. It was part of the house, fixed in place, impossible to remove. I stood in front of it one night with a half-filled box at my feet, staring at the yellowed plastic and the faded buttons. It was silent, inert. Nothing about it suggested it had ever carried a voice. I turned away without touching it. As the days passed, the house stopped feeling like a place I lived and started feeling like a location I was evacuating. I slept on a mattress on the floor once the bed was gone, surrounded by stacked boxes that cast long, uneven shadows at night. I kept the lights on even then, the bare bulb in the ceiling glaring down on me, making sleep shallow and unsatisfying. The echoes got worse. Without furniture to break them up, the rooms amplified everything. A cough sounded like a shout. The clink of keys rang too long. Even silence had weight now, stretching and compressing in ways that made my skin prickle. Sometimes, standing in the middle of an empty room, I'd stop and listen, not for knocks, not for voices, for absence. I wanted the house to feel abandoned, vacant, unused. Instead, it felt paused, like something had stepped away briefly and expected to return. On my last night there, I didn't unpack anything. I sat on the floor in the living room, back against the wall, phone in my hand, scrolling through nothing. The heater clicked on and off, its sound echoing through the empty space. The air felt stale, unmoving. I thought about the nights I'd spent sleeping in my car, the morning I'd found the note, the way the house had felt used when I came back too early. All of it seemed distant now, like it belonged to another version of me. That was comforting. I loaded the last box into my car just before dawn. The sky was pale and washed out, the kind of colorless morning that makes everything look unfinished. I took one last walk through the house, checking each room out of habit more than necessity. The kitchen was bare, the counter empty, no bowl, no note. The bedroom echoed softly when I stepped inside. The closet yawned open, hollow and dark. I stopped in the hallway. The intercom panel sat there like it always had. I stared at it for a long moment, half expecting it to crackle to life one last time, to acknowledge my departure. It didn't. The house remained silent, indifferent. That felt like a victory. I locked the door and didn't look back as I walked down the driveway. The motion light didn't turn on. The sun had risen enough that it wasn't needed. The house faded behind me, just another structure among many, stripped of significance. As I drove away, I told myself this was the end of it. New place, new routines, new noise. No walls that knew my voice. No corners that remembered me standing still in the dark. I imagined myself unpacking in the apartment, settling into a space that had never held me before. For the first time in weeks, the thought almost made me feel calm. Almost. Because even as I merged onto the main road, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, a small, unwelcome thought followed close behind. I was leaving a place that knew me, but I had no way of knowing whether I was leaving it alone. And that uncertainty, quiet, unresolved, and heavy, rode with me all the way to my new address. The apartment felt safer the moment I stepped inside. That wasn't logic. It was instinct. An immediate, almost childish relief that came from the most basic difference. This place wasn't mine yet. It didn't know my habits. It didn't recognize my footsteps. The walls hadn't learned my routines. There was a comfort in that, thin but real, like the first clean breath after leaving a room full of smoke. The building was the kind of mid-range complex you find everywhere in America, built with efficiency and sameness in mind. 3 stories, beige siding, a leasing office that smelled like cinnamon air freshener. The lobby had a bulletin board with flyers for yoga classes and lost pets and someone advertising house cleaning services. It wasn't charming, but it wasn't isolated either, and that was what I wanted most. Noise, movement, witnesses. The first thing I noticed was the cameras. They were mounted in the corners of the common hallways. Little black domes staring down from the ceiling, one above the mailboxes, another near the stairwell, another over the entrance doors. There was even a sign near the elevator that read, in polite block letters, "For your safety, this area is under surveillance." It was meant to be comforting. It worked on me more than I wanted to admit. I took my boxes up the stairs, key fob clicking the door open with a solid electronic beep. The sound felt official, controlled, like something that belonged to a system. I locked the door behind me and listened to the bolt slide into place. It wasn't the familiar deadbolt of my old house. It sounded sharper, cleaner, like a new tool biting into metal. Inside, the unit was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet. The refrigerator was newer. The hum was smoother, less rattling, more consistent. The floors weren't old creaking hardwood. They were laminate that barely made noise under my shoes. The windows didn't rattle when the wind pushed against them. Everything felt sealed, modern, closed off. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and caught myself looking for a bowl. There wasn't one. That should have been nothing. Instead, it made my stomach tighten, as if the absence itself were a vulnerability. I put the keys in a drawer, then opened it again and moved them to a different drawer, then back again. I hated the fact that my mind still worked in patterns, even here. I hated that I was already trying to establish a routine before I'd even unpacked. Unpacking took hours. The apartment echoed slightly at first, but as I stacked books on shelves and hung clothes in the closet, it began to absorb sound the way lived-in spaces do. I turned on the TV for background noise and let it play low, voices filling the rooms. I told myself it was normal. People did that all the time. It didn't mean I was afraid. By the end of the day, the place looked almost like mine. Not fully, but close enough that I could imagine living here without constantly checking my phone, without scanning corners, without listening for things that weren't there. That night, when I came home from work, I felt the old tension rise in my chest out of habit. Then I looked up and saw the hallway camera above the stairwell, its lens catching the light. I exhaled. I climbed the stairs, hearing distant sounds through the building. Someone's TV muffled behind a door, laughter, a dog barking once and being shushed. Ordinary noise, evidence of other lives stacked close around mine. That was what I'd wanted. That was what I'd been chasing. Inside my unit, I locked the door and stood still for a moment, listening. The apartment had its own voice, a faint air current through the vents, the refrigerator's low purr, the distant thud of a neighbor closing a cabinet. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden, nothing that suggested I was alone in an empty structure. I made something simple for dinner and ate at the counter, letting my shoulders drop for the first time in what felt like months. I watched a show without rewinding scenes because I'd missed them while listening for noises. I let my phone sit face down, the camera app unopened. When I finally went to bed, I turned the light off without hesitating. In the dark, the room felt normal, safe. And then the vent above the bedroom door clicked. It was small, just a soft plastic tick, the sound of a system cycling. Warm air began to flow, carrying with it a faint dry smell of dust, heat waking up after being idle. The air brushed against my face, steady and constant. I tried to relax into it, but as I lay there, listening, I realized something that made my skin prickle. The vent didn't sound like air moving. It sounded like whispering, not words, not voices, just the shape of sound, a thin, continuous hiss that rose and fell in subtle waves, almost like breath. If I focused on it too long, it seemed to form patterns, like the beginning of syllables that never fully arrived. I told myself it was my mind looking for meaning where none existed. The vent was just a vent. Air was just air. Still, my chest tightened. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, muffled by carpet and distance. A soft thump above me, followed by another and another, moving across the ceiling. Someone upstairs, walking from one room to another. Normal. Expected. The building was full of people. I wasn't alone. That should have reassured me. Instead, the footsteps dragged my attention upward, locking it there. I followed them without wanting to, my mind mapping the layout of the unit above mine. The steps crossed from left to right, paused briefly, then continued. A door creaked. A drawer slid open. The sounds filtered down through the ceiling in dull, softened shapes, just indistinct enough to be unsettling. I pulled the blanket higher and stared into the darkness. The footsteps stopped. The vent continued its quiet hiss. I lay there waiting, my body tense again, the sense of safety thinning like paper underwater. I reminded myself that this wasn't my old house. There was no intercom panel, no familiar walls, no camera gaps, no place for someone to hide unseen. Even if someone tried, there were cameras everywhere, neighbors close by, managers, maintenance. That logic held for a moment. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they didn't move across the ceiling. They stopped directly above my bedroom. One slow step, then another, then nothing. a presence held in place. I listened until my ears hurt, trying to decide if I was imagining the location, if my fear was turning ordinary building noise into something targeted. My heart pounded, and in the silence between one breath and the next, the vent's hiss sounded like it sharpened, like it narrowed into a deliberate exhale. I sat up in bed. The sound above remained still, as if whatever had been walking had paused to listen back. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself I was safe. I told myself the building's noise was proof of normal life around me. But as I lay back down, eyes open in the dark, one thought pressed in with the same steady weight as the footsteps overhead. I had moved to escape the silence. And yet the first thing this place taught me was that noise could be just as intimate as quiet. It could still feel like someone was there. It could still feel like someone was waiting. And it could still make my skin crawl, not because it was supernatural, but because it was real enough that I couldn't argue with it. The apartment wasn't haunted. It was occupied, and after everything I'd been through, that was the one thing I no longer knew how to trust. I was just starting to drift when my phone vibrated. Not a call, not a text. A single, sharp buzz against the mattress beside me, sudden enough to jolt my body into full alertness. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering, every nerve firing at once. The room was dark. The apartment quiet, except for the steady whisper of air through the vent and the faint, distant hum of traffic outside. For a moment, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A late notification, an app update, anything that didn't require me to pick up the phone. The vibration came again. I reached for it with a shaking hand and lifted it into view. The screen lit up my face with cold blue light, casting harsh shadows across the unfamiliar room. The notification banner sat there calmly, centered and unmistakable. Intercom. New activity detected. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process the words. Intercom. My thumb hovered over the screen, frozen. A wave of nausea rolled through me, slow and heavy, like my body understood the danger before my brain caught up. This wasn't possible. The apartment didn't have an intercom system. I knew that. I'd toured the place twice. I'd unpacked every room myself. There was no panel in the hallway, no wiring, no hardware. I hadn't installed anything. I hadn't even searched for intercoms. The notification pulsed softly, waiting. Against every instinct screaming at me not to, I tapped it. The app opened instantly. No loading screen, no login prompt. Just a familiar interface I hadn't seen since the house. The same dull gray background, the same minimal layout. At the top of the screen, a single line of text appeared. Live audio available. My throat closed. I turned the volume down as far as it would go, then hesitated and turned it back up just a fraction. Enough to hear, not enough to fill the room. My finger hovered over the button, my pulse loud enough that I worried it might interfere. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing, then static. Not harsh, not sudden. The same low, textured hiss I remembered too well. It filled my ear, intimate and close, like it wasn't traveling through the phone at all, but rising directly from inside my head. I sat up slowly, my back pressing against the headboard, eyes darting to the bedroom door, even though I knew there was nothing there to see. The static faded. Breathing replaced it. Slow, steady, familiar. I felt my stomach drop, my skin going cold all at once, as if the temperature in the room had shifted in response. The vent above the door clicked softly, its whisper growing just a little louder, just enough that I couldn't ignore the way it matched the rhythm coming through my phone. Then the voice spoke. "New place," it said. The tone was exactly the same as before. Calm, observational, almost conversational. No distortion, no strain. As if the distance between us didn't exist at all. I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The voice didn't seem to mind. "Took you long enough," it continued, a hint of something like amusement threading through the words. "You changed your route again." That broke something inside me. "You can't be here," I whispered. The words felt useless the moment they left my mouth. This system isn't even installed." A pause, then a soft exhale, close enough that I flinched. "It doesn't have to be," the voice said. "You bring it with you." My grip tightened on the phone until my fingers ached. My mind raced, scrambling for explanations that no longer existed. A prank, a hack, a delayed notification from the old house. Anything that kept this tethered to a place I'd already left behind. But the app showed my current location at the top of the screen. The apartment address. Accurate down to the unit number. "You locked the door faster tonight," the voice said. Didn't stop to listen this time. I felt exposed in a way that went beyond fear. This wasn't surveillance of a space. This was surveillance of me. My movements, my hesitations, the unconscious choices I made without thinking. "You don't need walls for this," the voice continued, almost gently. "Walls just made it easier for you to notice." The vent hissed again, louder now, the air brushing across my face in a way that felt deliberate. I glanced toward it despite myself, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision blur. "I didn't follow you," the voice said, as if correcting a misunderstanding. "You were already carrying me." The phone slipped slightly in my hand, slick with sweat. I shook my head, even though the voice couldn't see me. "That's not possible," I said. This isn't a place," the voice finished for me. "I know." The words landed with finality, cold and absolute. I thought about the first night, the radio, the static, the way it had waited for me to be home, the cameras, the gaps, the note placed exactly where my hand would land, the comment about being late, the way it noticed changes before I understood them myself. This had never been about the house. The house had just been the first environment, a testing ground. "You adapt quickly," the voice said. "That's why this works." The intercom app chimed softly, the same dull sound it made when it first activated in the old hallway. My stomach lurched at the familiarity of it. "We'll need to recalibrate," the voice added. "Apartments are louder." I felt something cold settle in my chest, heavier than panic, heavier than dread. Understanding. Slow, unavoidable, and complete. This wasn't an intruder. This wasn't a haunting. This was something that learned people, something that mapped routines, absorbed patterns, and moved with them when they changed environments. Something that didn't need walls or wiring or permission. Something that had never been tied to the house at all. The app screen flickered. "Get some sleep," the voice said calmly. "You've got work tomorrow." The audio cut out. The app closed itself. I sat there in the dark apartment, phone dead in my hand, listening to the vent breathe and the distant footsteps above me shift and settle. The building was full of life now. Sounds layered on sounds, but none of it brought comfort. Because for the first time, I understood the truth I'd been running from. I hadn't moved to escape it. I'd moved to prove whether it would come with me. And now I had my answer. Whatever this was didn't belong to a place. It belonged to my patterns. And as long as I kept living, it would always know exactly where to find me. It's been years since I moved into that apartment. Long enough that I'm supposed to call it time instead of distance. Long enough that people expect the story to soften at the edges, to lose detail, to become something I talk about in the past tense with a sense of closure. That hasn't happened. If anything, the memory feels sharper now, honed by repetition and the kind of quiet that only comes after you stop expecting answers. I still work nights. That part never changed. Different warehouse, different route, same hours, midnight to 8. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead just like they always have, casting everything in that flat, unreal glow that makes time feel suspended. My co-workers have rotated in and out over the years, faces changing, names forgotten. I've stayed. I keep my head down. I do the work. I leave when the shift ends. Routines are comforting when you don't trust spontaneity. I drive home the same way every morning, even though there are faster routes now. I like knowing exactly when the streetlights thin out, exactly where the road dips, exactly how long it takes before the first hint of daylight creeps over the horizon. I don't listen to the radio anymore. I keep the car quiet, the engine and tires the only sounds I allow. When I park, I sit for a moment before getting out. I always do that now. I scan the lot. I check reflections in windows. I note which cars are new, which ones weren't there the night before. I tell myself it's practical, awareness. Anyone who works nights learns to do this. That explanation has served me well enough that I don't challenge it anymore. Inside my apartment, the rituals take over. The door locks once, then again, then a third time, just to feel the mechanism catch. I don't rush. Rushing leads to mistakes. I learned that early. I set my keys down in the same place every night, inside a drawer now, not a bowl. I chose the drawer deliberately because it closes, because it hides what's inside, because it denies visibility. I still check it twice. The lights stay on until I'm in bed. Even then, the hallway light remains on, spilling a thin stripe across the floor. I don't like full darkness. I don't trust what I can't see, and I trust shadows even less. The apartment hums around me. Refrigerator, vents, distant neighbors starting their days. Normal sounds, harmless sounds. I catalog them anyway. I know the difference between the neighbor upstairs pacing and the neighbor upstairs dropping something. I know which vents click when the system cycles and which ones stay quiet. I know the exact pitch of the building settling in the early morning. Any deviation stands out immediately, like a wrong note in a familiar song. People tell me that sounds don't mean intent. They're right. That doesn't stop my body from reacting. I don't use smart home devices. No speakers, no assistants, no apps that listen in the background. My phone permissions are locked down tighter than anyone I know. I don't connect to public Wi-Fi. I don't talk about my schedule online. I don't post pictures of where I am or where I've been. I learned the hard way that patterns don't need explanations to be understood. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself pausing in the middle of a room, listening. I don't know what I'm listening for exactly. There's no single sound that signals danger anymore. No voice, no static, no intercom chime. Those things stopped eventually, or maybe they just faded into the background of everything else. That's the part that scares me most. I don't know when he left. I don't know if there was a final night, a last observation, a moment where the attention shifted elsewhere. There was no goodbye, no confirmation. One day, the notifications simply didn't come. The sense of being addressed faded into a more general awareness, less focused but never fully gone, like being watched from farther away. I've tried to tell myself that means it's over, that whatever this was lost interest, that I aged out of its curiosity or became too boring to track. That explanation works most days. It lets me function. It lets me sleep. Eventually. But some nights, lying in bed with the light still on, I realize something that unravels that comfort completely. If it really were gone, if it had truly stopped paying attention, I wouldn't still be doing this. I wouldn't still be careful about where I put my keys. I wouldn't still notice changes in timing. I wouldn't still flinch when an unfamiliar app updates itself without asking. I wouldn't still feel that tightening in my chest when I break a routine, even slightly. Whatever learned me did its job well. It taught me to be predictable. It taught me to self-monitor. It taught me that safety is a performance you repeat every day, even when no one is visibly watching. I've never heard the voice again, not directly, not clearly. But sometimes, when I'm running late, when traffic slows me down, or I stop somewhere I don't usually stop, I get the strangest sensation. Like I've disrupted something delicate. Like I've knocked a piece out of alignment and someone, somewhere, has noticed. Those are the nights I don't sleep at all. I don't know if he's still there. I don't know if he ever really was the way I understood him then. I've had years to replay every detail, to strip away fear and examine what remains. There are explanations that almost fit. Psychological ones, technological ones. None of them account for everything. What I do know is this: I never found an end to it. No confrontation, no escape, no proof that it stopped. Just a slow transition from being observed to living as if observation were permanent. People ask me why I still work nights. I tell them it's what I'm used to. That's true. But the real reason is simpler, and I never say it out loud. At night, I know exactly who's awake. I know who's supposed to be moving through the world and who isn't. Daytime blurs too much. Too many variables. Too many eyes. Too many patterns overlapping. At night, the rules are clearer. And if someone is still paying attention, if something is still listening, it's easier to feel it when the rest of the world is quiet. I don't know when he left. I only know that I never felt alone again after he arrived. And I'm not sure I ever will. I didn't go looking for it because I missed the fear. I went looking for it because I wanted proof that my life hadn't been rearranged by something that only existed in my head. Years had passed, and the story still lived in me in ways I couldn't explain to anyone without watching their expression shift. The polite concern, the quiet judgment, the unspoken suggestion that sleep deprivation and stress could make a man believe almost anything. So one night, after a shift that left me wired and restless, I pulled my old hard drive out of a shoebox in the back of my closet. I'd kept it the way people keep things they don't want to touch but can't throw away, wrapped in a soft cloth, labeled in my own handwriting with a date range I didn't like reading. The drive held the camera backups from the house, whatever the cloud hadn't eaten, whatever I downloaded in a desperate attempt to preserve evidence before I moved out. I hadn't opened those files in years. My current laptop didn't even have the right port anymore. I had to dig out an adapter, fumble with cables, sit at my kitchen table, in the apartment like I was setting up an experiment I already knew the outcome of. The room was quiet, except for the low purr of the refrigerator and the faint whisper of air through the vent. It reminded me, against my will, of the old kitchen, the tile floor, the bowl, the radio, the way silence felt like a presence rather than an absence. When the drive finally mounted, a list of folders appeared on the screen. Dates, times, camera labels. I clicked into the kitchen feed first. The file loaded slowly, grainy footage filling the screen. The fisheye lens curved the edges of the room inward, making the cabinets look slightly warped. The counter sat empty. The back door was visible, but only barely, its frame blending into the shadows near the edge of the camera's view. The stainless steel refrigerator reflected the room in a dull, distorted way, like a mirror that didn't want to cooperate. I watched for a minute, then fast-forwarded. Hours of nothing slid by in seconds, the heater cycling on and off, the faint movement of shadows when headlights passed outside, me walking through the frame at the end of the night, tired, shoulders hunched, keys in hand. I had to stop the video when I saw myself, not because it was shocking, but because it was strange. Watching my old life from a distance, like a surveillance video of someone I used to know. I watched myself set my keys down, move through the kitchen, open the fridge, stand there for a moment as if thinking. I looked normal, unaware, a man going through the motions. I pressed play again and forced myself not to blink. My goal was simple. I wanted to find a clean explanation for the gaps. Network errors, corrupted timestamps, anything that would make the missing 18 minutes feel like technology failing instead of someone intervening. The more time passed, the less I trusted my own memory. Maybe I'd misread the logs. Maybe the word manual had been a software term. Maybe I'd turned paranoia into a narrative. So I reviewed the footage carefully, like a bored technician rather than a frightened homeowner. I watched the kitchen from midnight to 2, then from 2 to 4, then back again. I toggled between cameras, comparing time codes, looking for inconsistencies. The routine became hypnotic, almost soothing in its repetition. Nothing happened. Nothing moved. The house remained empty, except for me. After an hour, my eyes started to burn. I rubbed them and leaned closer to the screen. That was when I noticed something I'd never noticed before. It wasn't in the center of the frame. It wasn't an obvious shadow crossing the floor or a door shifting. It was small, incidental, the kind of detail your brain edits out because it doesn't matter, until it does. A reflection on the refrigerator door. I paused the footage and rewound, then played it again at normal speed. I watched my past self move through the kitchen, keys clinking softly as they hit the counter. I watched him, me, open the fridge, the interior light spilling out into the room, washing the cabinets in pale illumination. And in that illumination, the stainless steel surface caught the scene behind me. I froze the frame. The reflection was faint, distorted by the brushed metal, warped by the camera angle. But it was there. A vertical shape behind me, near the edge of the hallway. Not the dark rectangle of a doorway. Not a coat rack. Not a shadow cast by furniture. A figure. Partial. Indistinct. Just enough to register as human in shape. Shoulders. Head. The suggestion of arms held close to the body. It wasn't facing the camera directly. It looked angled, as if standing just out of sight, using the hallway shadow as cover. I stared at the screen until my neck ached. My first instinct was denial. I leaned closer, adjusting the brightness, thinking maybe it was a trick of light, a reflection of the door frame, a distortion from the fridge handle, anything. But the shape remained consistent. I stepped forward, frame by frame, watching how the reflection changed as I moved. As the fridge door opened and closed, the light shifted, and with it, the reflection sharpened for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the silhouette to resolve more clearly. It was unmistakably a person, not in full detail, no facial features, no clothing texture, just the undeniable geometry of someone standing there, close enough to be in the room's reflected light, far enough into the hallway's darkness to remain mostly hidden. I sat back in my chair so quickly it scraped across the floor. The sound jolted me in my apartment kitchen, and for a moment my nervous system reacted as if the old house had come with it. Heart racing, breath short, skin cold. I looked around my apartment instinctively. Nothing. Just the quiet room, the closed blinds, the steady hum of modern appliances. But the cold feeling didn't fade. My hands were shaking now, fingers stiff, as if the years between then and now had collapsed into a single moment. I turned back to the screen. The paused frame stared at me like an accusation. I rewound again, played it again, paused and zoomed until the pixels broke apart into grain. The figure didn't disappear. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. Not a glitch, not an artifact, not a trick of metal and light, a presence. And the worst part wasn't that someone had been in my kitchen without my knowledge. That idea, terrifying as it was, fit into the story I'd been living with for years. The worst part was the timing. The clip was dated weeks before the intercom first spoke, weeks before the note, weeks before the camera gaps became impossible to ignore. The figure had been there long before I started listening for it, long before I had any language for what was happening. I stared at the silhouette in the fridge reflection, and a realization settled into my chest with slow, suffocating weight. I hadn't been chasing the beginning of it. I'd been living in the middle the whole time, and whatever had been standing in that hallway, close enough to watch me open my refrigerator, close enough to remain just outside my awareness, had never needed to announce itself. It had never needed to knock or speak or leave notes. Those were choices, signals, a way of letting me know, eventually, that it had been there all along. I closed the laptop, not calmly, not deliberately. I snapped it shut, like it might bite me. Like ending the image would end the reality behind it. The kitchen in my apartment remained still, but the sense of being observed returned with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, because now I had proof. Not a feeling, not a pattern, not an empty gap in a timeline. A figure captured by accident in a reflection I'd overlooked. And once you've seen something like that, once you've finally caught it in the act, you don't get to unsee it. You just get to wonder how many other times it was there, standing close, unseen, while you went on believing you were alone. I don't know when he stopped coming. That's the sentence I've practiced in my head, the one that sounds finished enough to pass for an ending. It fits neatly into conversations when people ask how it turned out, when they lean forward expecting something conclusive. I say it slowly, carefully, as if the pacing might make it truer. I don't know when he stopped coming. The truth is, I don't know if he ever did. After I closed the laptop that night, I didn't open it again for a long time. I unplugged the hard drive, wrapped it back in the cloth, and put it somewhere harder to reach than before. Not because I thought it was dangerous, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Evidence doesn't protect you once it exists. It only changes how you live with what you already know. Nothing happened after that. That's the part that makes this story harder to tell. There was no escalation, no final confrontation, no moment where the presence announced itself one last time, satisfied or bored or defeated. The intercom app never notified me again. No voices, no static, no gentle observations about my timing or my habits. The nights passed, the weeks stacked up. Life continued in the quiet, mechanical way it always does when you show up and do what's expected of you. I kept my routines, not because I was told to, because they were already there, etched into me. Locking doors the same way, putting my keys in the same drawer, leaving the light on in the hallway, sitting in my car for a moment before going inside. None of it felt like fear anymore. It felt like maintenance. People change after things happen to them. They call it growth if it looks healthy enough from the outside. I changed jobs once more, still nights, different building, different route, same hours. I moved apartments again. Then again, after that, I learned to look for certain things during tours. Vent placement, hallway sightlines, reflective surfaces. I learned which buildings amplified sound and which ones swallowed it. I learned how to blend in with noise instead of fighting it. I never installed cameras again. I told myself it was because I didn't want to live under constant surveillance. That explanation satisfied most people. It almost satisfied me. The real reason was simpler. Cameras don't stop you from being seen. They just decide when you get to notice it. Years passed without incident. No notes, no gaps, no reflections that didn't belong. If this were a different kind of story, that would be the resolution. The danger would be over. The threat neutralized by time and distance. I would be able to say it ended, even if I didn't understand how. But that isn't what happened. What happened is quieter than that. The sense of being observed faded, but it never disappeared. It became diffuse, less focused, like a pressure change you only notice when it's gone for a moment. I stopped reacting to it consciously, but my body never forgot. I still feel it sometimes, when I break a routine, when I take a different route home, when I linger somewhere longer than usual, when I hesitate before unlocking a door. It isn't fear, it's awareness. I don't listen for him anymore, not actively. I don't stand still in rooms, waiting for proof of something unseen. I've learned that waiting gives shape to things that might otherwise remain formless. Instead, I live. I work. I sleep when I can. I do the things people do when they believe their lives belong to them. And most days, it works. Most days, the world feels normal, predictable, harmless in its repetition. I move through it without thinking about reflections or blind spots or the way sound travels through walls. I forget the old house, the intercom, the voice, the figure in the refrigerator's dull metal skin, but forgetting isn't the same as erasing. Every now and then, I'll catch myself mid-action, hand hovering over a light switch, keys suspended for a fraction of a second above the drawer, and I'll feel it. Not a presence, not attention, recognition, like a habit resurfacing without context. I don't know if that means he's still there. I don't know if this thing, whatever it was, moved on to someone else, found new patterns to study, new lives to learn. I don't know if it ever needed me specifically, or if I was just convenient, available, consistent enough to be useful. What I do know is that nothing announced its departure. There was no moment where I felt alone again. The quiet just stayed. And quiet, I've learned, isn't proof of absence. It's just the absence of signals. I think about that reflection sometimes. The one I missed for weeks because I wasn't looking in the right place. How obvious it seems now. How easily it hid in plain sight. I wonder how many other reflections I never noticed. How many surfaces I passed every day without realizing what they could show if the angle were just right. I don't review old footage anymore. I don't check logs. I don't chase confirmation, because the most unsettling realization didn't come from the figure in the hallway or the voice in the wall. It came afterward, in the long stretch of nothing. If something like that can enter your life without permission, learn you without asking, and then leave, or stop interacting without explanation, there's no clean way to measure safety ever again. You don't get closure. You get adjustment. I don't know when he stopped coming. I don't know if that sentence even makes sense, now that I've had time to sit with it. Coming implies arrival, movement, effort, presence defined by action. Maybe nothing stopped. Maybe nothing left. Maybe the only real change was that I stopped being interesting enough to address directly. That thought doesn't keep me awake anymore. It just sits with me, quiet and unresolved. Like everything else that never asked for my attention, but shaped me anyway. Tonight, the apartment is still. No footsteps overhead. No vents clicking. No hum beyond the usual background of a building settling into sleep. My phone lies face down on the table. No notifications. No alerts. I lock the door. Once. Then again. Then I turn off the light and stand in the dark for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the silence stretch out around me. Nothing happens. And I don't know whether that's because the threat is gone, or because it no longer needs to remind me that it was ever there. I don't wait for an answer. I just stand there until the quiet feels normal again. And then I go on living, careful not to mistake silence for safety. Here's a reflective closing you can use at the end of the video. What unsettles me most about this story isn't the voice, the cameras, or the figure in the reflection. It's how quietly everything happened. Nothing exploded. Nothing ended cleanly. Life simply adjusted itself around fear until fear felt ordinary. That's the uncomfortable truth behind many true horror stories. Danger doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it watches, learns, and waits until you're the one changing your behavior without being asked. The real loss isn't safety, it's certainty. Once that's gone, even silence feels loud. But there's something quietly powerful here too. The narrator keeps living, keeps working, keeps choosing awareness over panic. Not because the threat vanished, but because life doesn't pause for unanswered questions. Maybe the scariest stories aren't about monsters at all, but about how much of ourselves we give up just to feel safe. So here's my question for you. Have you ever changed the way you live without being able to say exactly why?